When we think of colonial America, images of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, the bustling ports of Boston and Philadelphia, or the tobacco fields of Virginia come easily to mind. Yet, at the southeastern edge of this colonial mosaic, a very different kind of experiment was unfolding. Founded in 1733, Georgia was the last and arguably the most ambitious of Britain's original 13 American colonies. Its place as the 13th colony was not just a matter of chronology. Georgia's founding encapsulated a unique blend of philanthropy, strategic necessity, and imperial ambition that set it apart from every other British settlement in North America. Yet, to truly appreciate why Georgia holds such a singular place in American history, we must first look at the world into which it was born. A world of imperial rivalry, economic uncertainty, and social upheaval. Here, in the wild borderlands between British Carolina and Spanish Florida, dreams of social reform collided with the hard realities of survival and geopolitics. The result was a colony that was, from its inception, a fascinating crossroads, a social laboratory, a military buffer, and a microcosm of Britain's Atlantic Empire. In the following chapters, we will delve into the lives of the people who created Georgia, the challenges they faced, and the ideals they pursued. But here, at the outset of our journey, let us consider the overarching questions that make Georgia's founding so distinctive. Why did it take so long to settle this region? What motivated the British government and a group of philanthropic trustees to create an entirely new colony here? And what made their approach so different from those that came before? To answer these questions, we must consider both the immediate context of the early 18th century and the broader sweep of colonial history. First, let's look at the geography of possibility and peril. By the 1730s, the British Atlantic coast had been steadily colonized from north to south. Yet the region that would become Georgia remained a contested wilderness. It was not for lack of interest. Rather, it was due to the region's dangers and complexities. The area was home to powerful Native American nations, including the Creek and Yamacraw, and lay directly in the path of Spanish Florida's ambitions. It was also a region prone to tropical diseases, unpredictable weather, and daunting swamps and forests. Yet, for all its hazards, southernmost North America offered enormous promise. Fertile land, navigable rivers, and access to the Atlantic trade network made the region a potential economic powerhouse. For the British, the challenge was how to settle it, and for whom. Now let's examine the legacy of earlier colonies. Georgia's founders had the benefit of hindsight. They could look to the successes and failures of Virginia, South Carolina, and other colonies. They saw the dangers of social stratification, the corrosive effects of slavery, the instability of frontier settlements, and the persistent problem of poverty and crime in England itself. Armed with this knowledge, the men who would create Georgia set out to do something unprecedented, to build a colony that would serve not just as an economic engine, but as a model of social reform and imperial defense. Next, let's explore philanthropy, a utopian experiment. At the heart of Georgia, U.S. founding was a remarkable, and in some ways radical idea, that the colony could offer a new start for Britain's worthy poor. In the early 18th century, England was racked by poverty, debt, and overcrowded prisons. The notorious Fleet and Marshalsea prisons were filled with debtors, many of whom had been incarcerated for minor financial offenses. These men and women languished in misery, often with their families, with little hope of redemption. James Oglethorpe, a member of Parliament and a reform-minded humanitarian, became the driving force behind the Georgia Project. Horrified by the conditions he witnessed during a parliamentary inquiry into England's prisons, Oglethorpe began to envision a solution that was both charitable and practical. Resettle the worthy poor in America, where they could rebuild their lives as industrious farmers and soldiers. To implement his plan, Oglethorpe secured the support of like-minded philanthropists and politicians, forming a Board of Trustees 20, named individuals who would oversee the colony without compensation and ensure that it was run according to principles of public service, not private profit. With this unusual governing structure in place, the trustees set about creating a colony that would offer a haven for the poor. The trustees' vision was utopian, a society of small farmers free from the corrupting influences of slavery, land speculation, and hard liquor. They instituted rules to support this vision. Land would be distributed in equal modest plots. Inheritance would be tightly controlled to prevent land consolidation. Slavery and rum would be banned, and settlers would be expected to serve in the colony's defense. This philanthropic ambition set Georgia apart as the only British American colony founded explicitly for the benefit of the worst worthy poor. The resulting social experiment would shape the colony's early years and its enduring myth as a debtors' colony, a label that was only partly true but powerful in its symbolism. But philanthropy alone cannot explain why Georgia was founded. The colony's strategic importance as a buffer between British and Spanish territories played a vital role in its creation. Let's now turn to the subject of defense. Buffer colony on a hostile frontier. At the heart of Georgia's founding lay the ever-present shadow of Spanish Florida. In the early 18th century, the southern frontier was a volatile battleground where European empires clashed, and the balance of power hung in the balance. The trustees recognized that the new colony would need to be prepared to defend itself against both external threats and internal unrest. To address these concerns, they took several key steps. First, they strategically located the colony's capital at Savannah on the Atlantic coast, ensuring easy access for trade and communication with Britain. They also established a series of fortified settlements along the frontier, such as Fort Frederica at the mouth of the Altamaha River. These forts served as military outposts and administrative centers, helping to maintain order and protect the colony from potential invaders. Moreover, the trustees understood the importance of diplomacy in managing the volatile frontier. They appointed James Oglethorpe as the colony's first governor, recognizing his skills in negotiation and his commitment to peaceful coexistence with Native American nations. Oglethorpe's efforts to forge alliances with local tribes, such as the Yamacraw, proved instrumental in securing the colony's early years. He established trading relationships, negotiated land agreements, and sought to mediate disputes between settlers and indigenous peoples. These diplomatic achievements helped to create a buffer zone around the colony, shielding it from the conflicts that plagued neighboring regions. However, defense in Georgia was not solely reliant on military strength and diplomacy. The trustees also implemented measures to ensure the colony's long-term stability. They enacted laws to promote public order, such as prohibiting firearms to prevent settlers from engaging in reckless behavior. They also placed restrictions on land ownership to discourage speculation and hoarding, hoping to create a society of independent farmers. Additionally, the trustees sought to attract settlers with diverse skills and professions, recognizing the need for a well-rounded community that could sustain itself. Despite these precautions, life on the frontier was far from easy. Settlers faced challenges such as disease, harsh weather, and conflicts with both wildlife and indigenous peoples. Nevertheless, the colony's defensive preparations provided a foundation for resilience and growth, allowing Georgia to establish itself as a viable part of the British Empire in North America. Finally, let's consider the third piece of the puzzle: imperial strategy. Georgia's founding must be understood within the larger context of British, Spanish, and French rivalry for control of North America. The southern frontier was a fluid, contested space where empires vied for land, resources, and influence. By establishing Georgia, Britain hoped to solidify its claims, expand its trading network, and prevent its rivals from encroaching northward. The trustees' restrictions on land ownership, slavery, and alcohol were not just about philanthropy. They were designed to create a stable, disciplined, and loyal population capable of defending the empire. The colony's economy was intended to complement, not compete with, South Carolina's, producing silk, wine, and other goods for British markets. In conclusion, let's consider the themes that echo through Georgia's story. First, let's discuss philanthropy versus pragmatism. From the outset, the trustees' vision for Georgia was rooted in both idealism and practicality. Their desire to help the worthy poor was tempered by the need to create. So let's get into it. The dawn of the 18th century marked a pivotal era for the British Empire. The Atlantic world, a vast, interconnected web of peoples, goods, and ideas stretching from Europe to Africa and the Americas, was in flux. Empires clashed, alliances shifted, and the fate of continents would be decided not just by kings and admirals, but also by merchants, planters, enslaved Africans, and Native American nations. For Britain, the competition for North America was fierce and fraught with peril. Spanish, French, and a dazzling array of indigenous powers all vied for influence, resources, and survival. In this context, every new settlement, every diplomatic overture, and every skirmish must be seen as part of a larger contest, a contest that would shape not only the continent, but the very future of the British Empire. This is Crash Course, North America. Britain's 18th century empire was built on the foundation of three pillars. First was a dynamic and ambitious monarchy. By 1700, England, soon to be Great Britain after the 1707 Act of Union with Scotland, was emerging as a global power, fueled by a growing merchant class and a burgeoning colonial empire. Second was a powerful merchant class seeking ever-growing profits. The British Empire was above all a merchant's empire. Its leaders believed that prosperity and power flowed from trade, the extraction of raw materials from the colonies, their shipment to Britain, and the sale of manufactured goods back across the Atlantic and around the world. Colonies were not just distant outposts. They were essential cogs in a complex machine of commerce, credit, and consumption. Sugar from the West Indies, tobacco from Virginia, rice from Carolina, and later, indigo and cotton from the southern mainland colonies enriched British merchants and filled the royal treasury. Finally, there was an ideology that justified and directed imperial ambition. Imperial philosophy held that colonies existed to benefit the mother country and should be subordinate to its interests. Mercantilism was the guiding economic ideology, the notion that economic activity should serve the interests of the state and that colonies existed to benefit the mother country. This meant strict control over colonial trade through navigation acts, a constant search for new markets, and a suspicion of rival powers. But Britain's ambitions were not merely economic. The empire's leaders sought to spread Protestantism, forge new identities, and secure strategic advantage over their Catholic rivals, most notably Spain and France. Colonization, in this view, was an act of both faith and force. In this imperial chess match, the rules were clear. Trade was strictly regulated. Colonial assemblies could make no laws without London's approval, and the movement of people and resources was carefully monitored. All of this was overseen by a growing bureaucracy of imperial officials and boards, such as the Board of Trade, whose job it was to ensure the empire's health. By 1700, England had laid claim to several key colonies. In North America, the 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast from Maine to Georgia. The original 13 included Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Between them, these colonies had a population of about 250,000 people, with the largest cities being Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But England was not alone on the continent. To the south, the Spanish Empire loomed large, anchored by its vast holdings in the Southwest and the Caribbean. To the north, the French claimed vast territories stretching from Canada to the Mississippi, and scattered across the interior were numerous Native American nations with their own claims and ambitions. The Spanish Empire in the early 18th century was a sprawling but aging dominion. While its Caribbean and South American colonies were still quite lucrative, they were increasingly difficult to defend. Nevertheless, Spain remained a formidable presence, especially in Florida and the Gulf Coast. Florida was more than a remote outpost. It was a military and diplomatic center, a haven for runaway slaves from Carolina, and a base for Catholic missionary activity among Native Americans. Moreover, the Spanish saw Florida as a buffer zone between their vast American empire and the burgeoning British colonies to the north. At the same time, the Spanish in Florida recognized the threat posed by the British colonies to their south. They feared British expansionism and the potential loss of valuable territories. As a result, the Spanish authorities in Florida were eager to prevent any British incursions into their domain. One way they tried to achieve this was by encouraging enslaved Africans to flee to Florida, offering them freedom and land in return for conversion to Christianity and military service. This policy was motivated by several factors. Firstly, it was a means to undermine the economic foundation. The year is 1726, and you are a London tradesman. Your business is good, your children are thriving, and your house is open to friends. One afternoon, you meet your friend Lord Fanny for drinks, and he asks you to lend him a few pounds to cover a pressing bill. Because you trust him and because you have a bit of spare cash, you do. But 2 months later, when Fanny returns to repay the loan, he tells you that his estate has gone bankrupt and he has no way to repay you. Not wanting to make a fuss, you accept a promissory note and let him off. For now, 4 months later though, Fanny is still unable to repay you, and now whispers are circulating that he may not ever be able to. You know that Fanny is a man of means, but will he ever use those means to repay you? If he doesn't, you face ruin. What do you do? If you were a tradesman in early 18th century England, there was only one answer to your dilemma. You sued Fanny in the Court of King's Bench, where a judge swiftly granted a writ of fieri facias, meaning let it be done, which authorized the bailiff to seize any of Fanny's property to pay your debt. And within hours, the bailiff was dragging Fanny to the nearest prison to serve his sentence. You got your money, but Fanny faced 5 years in debtor's prison without hope of parole. Whether or not Fanny could pay you back did not matter. In early 18th century England, the law offered no distinction between intentional and accidental debt. Trade was essential to the English economy, but so was lending money, and that meant that lawsuits over debt were constant. As a result, England's prisons, including the infamous Fleet Marshalsea and King's Bench prisons in London, were filled with men like Fanny, incarcerated not because they were presumed guilty of wrongdoing, but solely because they could not repay their loans. That might sound unimaginable to us today, but for much of the last 400 years, owing money was just such a serious offense that you could end up behind bars for it, sometimes for years. And yet in the early 18th century, these debtor prisons inspired one of the first major campaigns for prison reform, thanks to a group of English aristocrats and reformers known as the worthy poor. The term worthy poor refers to a class of English beggars, paupers, and prisoners who were generally seen as honest, but unlucky innocent victims of circumstance rather than malicious individuals looking to get something for nothing. In other words, people who found themselves imprisoned for debt because of bad luck or exploitation, not because they were trying to scam someone out of money. And the term captures the essence of the English debtors movement, a campaign that sought to separate the unfortunate but honest from those who genuinely deserved punishment. As far as we can tell, the term worthy poor was coined by English cleric and philosopher John Wesley, founder of Methodism. Like many of his contemporaries, Wesley believed that society should take care of those who found themselves down on their luck, but only if they were deserving of help. So who qualified as a member of the worthy poor? Well, broadly speaking, the category included individuals who were neither vicious nor idle. There were people who could not work, such as the elderly or disabled, those who had been temporarily unlucky, such as Fanny and his fellow tradesmen, and groups facing systematic disadvantage, such as young women accused of prostitution or former servants who could not find new positions. This approach allowed the English debtors to frame their campaign for reform in carefully neutral terms, stressing their commitment to helping the truly needy while avoiding the controversial topic of poverty more broadly. Of course, in practice, applying the worthy poor label to anyone involved in the English debtors movement was inherently political and relied heavily on stereotypes and personal biases. Nonetheless, the concept proved incredibly useful in galvanizing support for the cause, especially among religious leaders and philanthropists. Indeed, the notion of the worthy poor continues to shape debates about welfare and entitlement today. When it comes to how many people qualified as worthy poor in early 18th century England, that's harder to say. Estimates vary wildly based on who you ask, ranging from 20% to 90% of the population. However, we do know that the English debtors considered poverty itself a sign of moral worthiness. That is to say, if you couldn't afford to pay your debts, then you probably deserved sympathy, not punishment. Take, for example, the case of Mary Tofts, a young mother imprisoned for debt in the 1720s. Mary owed her arrest to her ex-husband Thomas, who after being sentenced to prison for assault used Mary as collateral. When she couldn't pay his debt, the prison wardens took her instead. She spent 3 weeks in Marshalsea prison before her brother paid her debt and released her. Her story is tragic, but hardly unusual. Across England, there were thousands of families locked together in Marshalsea and other debtor prisons, sometimes for years at a time. In fact, entire communities of prisoners developed inside these jails, with children born and raised in their cells and schools established to educate their offspring. As the son of an aristocrat, James Oglethorpe had never suffered want in his life. Nevertheless, he dedicated himself to the English debtors movement after seeing the plight of his close friend, Robert Castell, who died of smallpox in Fleet Prison in 1728. After hearing reports of corruption and cruel treatment of debtors from fellow MPs, Oglethorpe decided to investigate for himself. He and 2 fellow MPs visited 6 of London's most notorious prisons, meeting with prisoners and administrators to hear their side of the story. What they found was shocking. The prisons were filthy and dangerous, filled with disease and despair. Guards routinely abused their authority, charging exorbitant fees for basic services, and in some cases holding prisoners hostage until their families paid up. What's more, he discovered that many of these prisoners were not hardened criminals, but ordinary citizens who had simply fallen on hard times. Their crimes were not malicious, but desperate attempts to survive. This experience prompted Oglethorpe to launch a parliamentary inquiry into the state of English prisons, which resulted in the publication of 2 reports detailing the horrors of debtor imprisonment. These reports sparked public outrage and led to the eventual release of thousands of prisoners. But Oglethorpe was not satisfied with this modest victory. He wanted to do more to help the worthy poor. So he turned his attention to America. In 1732, he helped found the colony of Georgia as a place where the worthy poor could start new lives free from the stigma and constraints of English society. The colony was intended as an experiment in philanthropy and social reform, offering prisoners a second chance at life outside the rigid confines of early 18th century England. However, this experiment was not without its flaws. Many of the settlers were ill-equipped for life in the New World, and the colony's idealistic vision of communal living and economic equality proved difficult to maintain. Additionally, the ban on slavery, intended to ensure equality for all settlers, ultimately deprived them of the labor necessary to develop the colony's economy. Despite its shortcomings, Georgia offered a glimpse of a different way of thinking about punishment and redemption. By the 18th century, the link between poverty and crime had become increasingly clear. People experiencing poverty were not only committing crimes, but were also disproportionately the victims of crime. To many reformers like Oglethorpe, this suggested that poverty was not merely a matter of individual misfortune, but a societal failure. By the middle of the century, English thinkers were beginning to argue that addressing poverty and inequality was not just a moral imperative, but also a practical strategy for preventing crime and maintaining social order. James Oglethorpe, founder and visionary. Introduction. James Edward Oglethorpe stands as one of the most compelling figures of the early 18th century British Atlantic world. Soldier, parliamentarian, reformer, and colonial founder, Oglethorpe's career reflected a passionate commitment to humanitarian ideals and social innovation. Best known as the principal founder of Georgia, the last of the 13 original American colonies, he envisioned a society that would offer a fresh start to England's worthy poor and serve as a bulwark against Spanish expansion. Oglethorpe's leadership, relationships, and vision were instrumental in shaping the early colony, while his work with the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America reflected a broad experiment in philanthropic colonialism. Oglethorpe's biography and motivations. A. Early life and military career. James Oglethorpe was born in 1696 into a well-connected English gentry family, the youngest son of Sir Theophilus Oglethorpe and Lady Eleanor Oglethorpe. Growing up in Surrey, he received an elite education at Eton College and later attended Corpus Christi College, Oxford. The Oglethorpe family had a history of royal service, and James's upbringing was marked by privilege, responsibility, and an early exposure to public affairs. Oglethorpe's early adulthood was shaped by military service. He entered the British Army and saw action fighting the Ottoman Turks as a volunteer in the Austrian Army. The discipline and organizational skills he acquired as a soldier would later serve him well as a colonial founder. Returning to England, Oglethorpe leveraged his social connections and military reputation to secure a seat in Parliament for Haslemere in 1722, a constituency his family had long represented. B. The plight of English debtors and social reform. Oglethorpe's parliamentary career began conventionally, but an event in 1728 changed the trajectory of his life. One of his close friends, Robert Castell, died in the Fleet prison after contracting smallpox in squalid conditions. Castell's crime was debt, a common fate for many in early 18th century England, where debtors' prisons were notoriously cruel and corrupt. Appalled by his friend's death and by the broader suffering of debtors, Oglethorpe launched a campaign for prison reform. He chaired a parliamentary committee to investigate prison conditions, exposing abuses and advocating for humane treatment. The committee's 1729-1730 report caused a public outcry and led to some modest reforms. But for Oglethorpe, it was clear that deeper social solutions were needed. He became convinced that many of England's worthy poor and debtors were victims of circumstance, deserving not punishment, but opportunity. C. Motivations for the Georgia colony. Oglethorpe's humanitarian instincts, combined with strategic and economic considerations, led to the idea of founding a new colony in America. He envisioned a place where honest but unfortunate people could start anew, free from the cycle of poverty and imprisonment. At the same time, the British government was eager to strengthen its southern frontier in North America against Spanish Florida and French Louisiana. Thus, the Georgia Project combined philanthropy, imperial ambition, and social engineering. Oglethorpe and his associates sought to create a haven for the poor, a buffer against foreign threats, and an orderly, virtuous society that would avoid the pitfalls of other colonies. The two, leadership, relationships, and vision for Georgia. A. The role of the trustees. In 1732, Oglethorpe and a group of like-minded philanthropists petitioned King George II for a royal charter to establish the colony of Georgia. The king granted the charter, and the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America were formed. This body, consisting of Oglethorpe and 20 others, was unique among colonial governing authorities in that it operated as a board of unpaid gentlemen tasked with overseeing the social, economic, and legal foundations of the new settlement. B. Oglethorpe's leadership style. Oglethorpe quickly emerged as the de facto leader of the venture, combining vision with practical energy. Unlike many colonial founders, he was not content to direct affairs from afar. Instead, he personally led the first group of settlers, the first 40, across the Atlantic and remained in Georgia for nearly a decade. His hands-on approach, military discipline, and moral seriousness impressed many, but could also be divisive. Oglethorpe's leadership was marked by pragmatism and adaptability. He responded to crises, negotiated with Native Americans, and adapted rules to changing circumstances. Moral authority. He embodied the trustees' values of sobriety, hard work, and fairness, and sought to inspire these in the colonists. Personal sacrifice. He refused a salary and shared the hardships of the settlers, earning respect even from critics. C. Relationships with key groups. The settlers. Oglethorpe's relationship with the settlers was complex. On the one hand, he was seen as a benefactor, providing land, tools, and guidance. On the other hand, his strict enforcement of the trustees' rules, such as bans on rum and slavery and limits on landholding, sometimes provoked resentment. Many settlers, particularly those with prior colonial experience, chafed under these restrictions and lobbied for change. The trustees. As the public face of the trustees, Oglethorpe had to balance their ideals with the realities on the ground. The trustees' vision of a classless, sober, and industrious society was admirable but difficult to sustain. Oglethorpe often found himself mediating between the trustees' directives from London and the demands of the colonists. Native American allies. One of Oglethorpe's great achievements was his relationship with the Creek and Yamacraw Indians. He forged alliances based on respect, negotiation, and fair dealing, learning their languages and customs. The most famous of these was his friendship with Tomochichi, chief of the Yamakras, who helped secure peaceful relations and land for the new colony. Oglethorpe's diplomacy helped Georgia avoid the devastating conflicts that plagued other colonies, Germans and Jews. See Achievements and Limitations. The trustees' achievements included the peaceful settlement of Savannah, innovative town planning, alliances with Native Americans, and the provision of a safety valve for England's poor. Their ban on slavery, though ultimately reversed, delayed the entrenchment of the plantation system and allowed for a different social experiment. However, the trustees' central control, rigid rules, and idealistic policies often clashed with reality. Settlers resented the lack of self-government and the economic restrictions. The trustees' inability to adapt quickly led to unrest and emigration. In 1752, the trustees surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony. The experiment in philanthropic governance was over, but its legacy endured in the colony's diversity, resilience, and civic traditions. Legacy and historical significance, Spanish and other colonial powers. As a military leader, Oglethorpe oversaw the defense of the colony against Spanish incursions from Florida, organizing the construction of forts and leading expeditions. His military background was invaluable in these efforts, although not all campaigns were successful. His blend of martial and diplomatic skills helped maintain Georgia's precarious position. Third, the vision for Georgia. Ideals and realities. A. Social and economic principles. The trustees' charter for Georgia reflected a strong philanthropic vision, heavily influenced by Oglethorpe's ideals. The key principles included land equality. Each settler received a small, equal plot of land, intended to prevent the rise of a landed aristocracy and promote a society of independent yeoman farmers. No slavery. The trustees banned slavery in Georgia, aiming to encourage hard work, social equality, and avoid the economic and moral pitfalls seen in nearby South Carolina. No rum. Alcohol was prohibited to promote sobriety and industriousness. No lawyers. Legal disputes were to be settled by local magistrates, reflecting a distrust of the litigiousness and complexity of English law. The trustees also encouraged religious freedom, with the exception of Catholics, welcoming persecuted groups such as Moravians, Lutherans from Salzburg, and Jews. B. The worthy poor and social engineering. Oglethorpe's vision for Georgia was fundamentally a social experiment. The worthy poor, those who had fallen into poverty through no fault of their own, were to be given a chance at redemption, not through charity alone, but through honest labor and community discipline. In this, Georgia was a radical departure from other colonies, which often replicated English social hierarchies and economic inequalities. Oglethorpe's hope was to create a virtuous, egalitarian society that would set an example for both England and America. See challenges and adjustments. Reality proved more difficult than theory. Georgia's climate and soil were less favorable than anticipated, and many settlers lacked the agricultural skills needed for success. The ban on slavery and restriction on landholding were increasingly unpopular, especially as neighboring South Carolina prospered with slave-based rice and indigo plantations. By the late 1740s, pressure from settlers led the trustees to relax many of the original restrictions. Slavery was legalized, land grants expanded, and economic growth accelerated, but the original philanthropic vision was diluted. Oglethorpe, disillusioned and exhausted by conflict and criticism, returned to England in 1743. He never returned to Georgia, though he continued to advocate for reform causes at home. 4. The trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America. A. Organization and governance. The trustees were a diverse group of English philanthropists, clergymen, politicians, and merchants. Appointed in 1732 for a period of 21 years, they operated as a non-profit trust, with no personal gain allowed. Their governance structure was unique. They held complete legal authority over Georgia, passing laws, appointing officials, and managing finances from London. Annual reports, correspondence, and the rules and orders of the trustees reveal their meticulous planning and idealism. They imposed detailed rules on land tenure, inheritance, trade, and social conduct. B. Funding and recruitment. The trustees raised funds through subscriptions and parliamentary grants. They recruited settlers from all over England and Europe, focusing on those who were industrious but poor, as well as religious refugees. The trustees' promotional literature presented Georgia as a land of opportunity and virtue, combining appeals to philanthropy, patriotism, and faith. Their efforts attracted a diverse population, including English, Scots, A. Oglethorpe's later life and reputation. After leaving Georgia, Oglethorpe continued to serve in Parliament and advocate for reform causes, including opposition to slavery and support for religious tolerance. He lived to a great age, dying in 1785, and was celebrated in both England and America as a humanitarian and patriot. B. The vision realized and compromised. Oglethorpe's vision for Georgia was both realized and compromised. The colony's foundations in equality, charity, and religious freedom set it apart, but the pressures of economy and demography transformed it into a more typical Southern colony. The initial ban on slavery, though reversed, contributed to later debates over slavery and reform in America. C. Enduring lessons. The story of Oglethorpe and the trustees offers enduring lessons about social reform, leadership, and the limits of utopian planning. Oglethorpe's blend of idealism and pragmatism, his commitment to the poor and oppressed, and his willingness to innovate remain inspiring, even as his failures remind us of the complexity of social change. Conclusion. James Oglethorpe's life was a testament to the power of vision and commitment in shaping history. As the founder of Georgia, he sought to create a society that would embody both charity and discipline, opportunity and order. His leadership, relationships, and ideals left an indelible mark on the colony and on American history more broadly. The trustees' experiment in philanthropic colonialism, though ultimately overtaken by economic and political realities, stands as a remarkable chapter in the history of social reform. Oglethorpe's legacy endures in the values of equality, tolerance, and compassion that he championed, and in the ongoing quest to balance idealism with practical governance. The Charter and the Plan. Georgia's unique colonial blueprint introduction. The founding of Georgia in 1732 marked a pivotal moment in colonial American history. Unlike its predecessors, Georgia was conceived as a grand social experiment, a place where the failures and excesses of older colonies might be avoided through carefully crafted laws and a visionary plan of settlement. Central to this vision were the 1732 Charter and the regulations imposed by the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America. Together, these legal, economic, and social blueprints sought to create a society founded on equality, sobriety, industriousness, and humanitarian ideals. This blog explores the contents and purposes of the 1732 Charter, Georgia's distinctive rules on land tenure, inheritance, alcohol, and slavery, and how these policies set Georgia apart from its neighbors, especially South Carolina. I. The 1732 Charter, Legal, Economic, and Social Blueprints. A. The context of the Charter. By the early 18th century, England's American colonies were well established, but not without social and economic problems. The southernmost mainland colony, South Carolina, was flourishing economically, but plagued by social inequality, reliance on slave labor, and constant threats from Spanish Florida. Meanwhile, Britain's cities, particularly London, teemed with poverty, debtors, and social unrest. Philanthropists and social reformers, led by James Oglethorpe, saw an opportunity to address these issues through a new colony. B. Legal structure and authority. On June 9, 1732, King George II signed the charter that formally created the province of Georgia. The document granted legal authority to the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America. A group of 21 men, including Oglethorpe, most of whom had philanthropic and reformist backgrounds. The trustees were given sweeping powers. Governance. The trustees would govern Georgia for 21 years, making all laws and decisions, after which control would revert to the Crown. Land ownership. The charter defined boundaries that stretched from the Savannah to the Altamaha River and from the Atlantic coast to the South Seas, a vast and somewhat vague territory. Religious freedom. With the exception of Catholics, seen as potential Spanish sympathizers, the colony was open to people of all Protestant faiths. Economic development. The trustees were empowered to grant land, raise money, and regulate trade with the aim of making Georgia both a buffer against Spain and a productive English settlement. See social and humanitarian goals. Perhaps most remarkable was the trustees' commitment to social experimentation. The colony would offer a new start for the worthy poor and persecuted religious minorities, avoid the formation of an aristocratic planter elite, promote small independent landholders, ban the evils of slavery and hard liquor, which trustees believed were responsible for social decay elsewhere. This blueprint reflected both Enlightenment ideals and practical concerns of empire building. Second, Georgia's rules, land tenure, inheritance, alcohol, and slavery bans. A. Land tenure and inheritance. Georgia's land system was unlike any other in the British colonies, designed to prevent the concentration of wealth and power. 1. Land grants and distribution. Each male settler, head of household, received 50 acres of land for himself and an additional 50 acres for each dependent, wife, child, servant, up to a maximum of 500 acres. Land was distributed in compact townships, with individual lots and communal squares, inspired by the orderly grids of English towns. 2. Restrictions and rationale. No large estates. Unlike South Carolina, where planters amassed huge tracts of land, Georgia's system was meant to create a society of small farmers. No female inheritance. Land was to descend only through the male line, on the assumption that men would best serve as the colony's defenders and laborers. No sale or lease. Land could not be sold, mortgaged, or leased. This rule was meant to prevent speculation and absentee landlordism, ensuring that land remained in the hands of productive resident colonists. 3. Intended effects. The trustees believed these policies would foster equality, prevent the rise of a landed aristocracy, and keep Georgia free from the instability and class conflict that plagued other colonies. B. Alcohol. Ban alcohol, particularly distilled spirits like rum, was seen by the trustees as a root cause of poverty, crime, and disorder. 1. The rule. The trustees prohibited the importation, sale, and consumption of ardent spirits, rum, brandy, and other distilled liquors. Beer and wine, considered less harmful, were permitted in moderation. 2. Rationale. The ban aimed to promote health, industry, and order among the settlers. It also sought to prevent the exploitation of Native Americans through the liquor trade, a common problem elsewhere. 3. Enforcement and challenges. The alcohol ban proved difficult to enforce. Rum smuggling and illicit distillation were common, and settlers often complained that the rule was unrealistic, especially given the hot climate and hard labor. C. Slavery ban. Perhaps the most radical of Georgia's rules was the outright prohibition of slavery. 1. The rule. The charter and subsequent regulations forbade the importation and use of enslaved Africans or Native Americans in the colony. All labor was to be performed by free white settlers, or, in some cases, indentured servants. 2. Rationale. Trustees believed slavery was morally corrupting and economically detrimental to the small farmer society they wanted to build. They also feared that a slave-based economy would replicate the social divisions, unrest, and vulnerability to Spanish attack seen in South Carolina. 3. Social and strategic goals. By banning slavery, the trustees hoped to attract industrious, self-sufficient settlers who would serve as a reliable militia. The policy also aimed to promote equality and discourage absentee ownership. 4. Exceptions and evolution. Initially, even enslaved workers, already present on plantations just north of Georgia's borders, were forbidden to enter the colony. Over time, however, pressure from settlers, economic hardships, and the lure of profits from rice and indigo led to the gradual erosion of the ban, culminating in the legalization of slavery in 1751. 3rd. How Georgia was to be different from South Carolina and other colonies. A. Economic and social contrasts. Georgia was explicitly designed as a countermodel to South Carolina and, to some extent, Virginia and other older colonies. 1. Land and society. South Carolina, dominated by wealthy planters, vast estates, and a rigid class structure with a majority enslaved population. Georgia, envisioned as a society of modest, independent farmers, free from the social stratification and instability associated with large plantations and slavery. 2. Labor and demographics. South Carolina's economy depended on enslaved African labor for rice and indigo plantations. The white population was often outnumbered by enslaved people, leading to fears of rebellion and insecurity. Georgia's founders hoped to avoid this imbalance by relying only on free settlers who would defend the frontier. 3. Urban planning. Georgia's towns, especially Savannah, were planned with orderly grids, central squares, and communal lands, contrasting with the haphazard development seen elsewhere. B. Political and legal differences. 1. Governance. Georgia's trustees, based in London, governed directly and without personal profit, in contrast to the proprietary or royal governments of other colonies. There was little provision for local self-government in Georgia's early years, reflecting the trustees' desire to maintain social discipline and philanthropic control. 2. Legal system. The early legal code was relatively simple, with a strong emphasis on mediation and local magistrates rather than formal courts or lawyers. The trustees actively discouraged litigation, believing that disputes should be settled amicably within the community. C. Religious and humanitarian aspirations. 1. Religious toleration. Georgia was open to all Protestants, including persecuted groups such as Lutherans from Salzburg and Jews from Spain and Portugal. This was more liberal than South Carolina, though Catholics were excluded due to fears of Spanish influence from Florida. 2. The worthy poor and redemption. Georgia's founders, inspired by Enlightenment and Christian values, sought to rescue England's debtors and deserving poor from hopelessness. The colony was advertised as a place where hard work, sobriety, and moral living would be rewarded, and where even those who had fallen on hard times could regain dignity and self-sufficiency. 4. The realities and challenges of utopia. A. Implementation and discontent. While the trustees' plan was bold and idealistic, its application in Georgia was fraught with difficulty. 1. Land and labor problems. Many early settlers lacked the skills, resources, or inclination to farm successfully on small plots, especially in the unfamiliar climate and soil of coastal Georgia. The ban on slavery, while principled, made Georgia less economically competitive with South Carolina, where large plantations thrived on enslaved labor. 2. Social unrest. Settlers chafed under restrictions on land sales, inheritance, and trade. Many demanded the right to own more land, use enslaved labor, and govern themselves. Some left the colony altogether, moving to South Carolina or other colonies where opportunities seemed greater. B. Pressure and compromise. By the late 1740s, mounting economic struggles and settler petitions forced the trustees to reconsider their rules. 1. Relaxation of rules. The ban on slavery was lifted in 1751, and large landholdings were permitted. The trustees' experiment in centralized philanthropic governance gradually gave way to more conventional colonial practices. 2. Transition to royal colony. In 1752, the trustees surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony with an elected assembly and laws similar to other colonies. The distinctive social and economic blueprint of the early years faded, though traces of its original ideals remained. V. The legacy of Georgia's charter and Plan A, lasting impacts. While the trustees' utopian model did not survive intact, it left important legacies. Urban planning. Savannah's layout, with its squares and orderly streets, remains a testament to the original vision. Diversity. Early Georgia was more religiously and ethnically diverse than many colonies, hosting English, Scots, Germans, Jews, and others. Social experimentation. The colony's early years served as a laboratory for social reform, influencing later debates about land, labor, and equality in America. B. Lessons learned. The story of Georgia's charter and plan offers enduring lessons. Idealism versus pragmatism. Lofty ideals can inspire, but must be adaptable to local realities. Social engineering. Top-down reforms are challenging to sustain, especially in dynamic, diverse settler societies. Humanitarian ambition. Even failed experiments can advance the cause of social justice and inform future efforts. Conclusion. The 1732 Charter and the Trustees Our Rules for Georgia represented one of the boldest experiments in colonial history, a conscious attempt to create a society of equality, sobriety, and virtue, insulated from the injustices and excesses seen elsewhere in the British Empire. Though the practical challenges of frontier life and economic competition eventually forced many changes, the ambition of Georgia's founders remains impressive for its time. Their experiment left a mark on the colony's identity and contributed to the broader American story of striving for a more just and humane society. The legacy of Georgia's unique charter and plan continues to invite reflection on the balance between vision and reality in the shaping of new communities. Georgia as a buffer colony, defense and diplomacy were. Introduction: a colony on the edge. When James Oglethorpe and his first band of settlers arrived on the banks of the Savannah River in 1733, the founding of Georgia was more than a philanthropic experiment. It was a deliberate act of imperial strategy, an assertion of British power on a volatile frontier. Georgia was a colony carved out of the wilderness not just to offer hope to the worthy poor of England, but to stand as a bulwark against the ambitions of Spain, headquartered just south in Florida. Georgia's birth, therefore, was both a humanitarian gamble and a military calculation. This dual purpose would shape its early years, from the design of its towns to the alliances forged with neighboring native nations. To understand Georgia, we must look closely at its role as a buffer colony, how it embodied the anxieties, ambitions, and entanglements of the 18th century British Empire. 2. Britain, Spain, and the southern frontier, imperial rivalry in the Americas. By the early 1700s, North America was a patchwork of rival empires and native nations. The British, Spanish, and French all laid claim to vast swaths of territory, but their actual control was often tenuous, especially in the South. South Carolina, the southernmost British colony, was thriving economically but acutely vulnerable. Its rich rice plantations and port of Charleston attracted both profit and peril. South of the Savannah River, Spanish Florida was a persistent thorn in Britain's side. The Spanish outpost at St. Augustine was both a military fortress and a base for Catholic missionary activity among native peoples, anathema to the Protestant British. More importantly, Spanish authorities offered a haven to enslaved Africans fleeing from Carolina, promising them freedom if they converted to Catholicism. This policy not only undermined Carolina's plantation economy, but also stoked fears of slave rebellion. The buffer colony concept. British planners recognized that the best way to secure South Carolina's borders was to create a buffer colony, a populated, fortified region that would absorb or repel Spanish incursions before they could threaten the heart of the British South. The idea was not new. The French had established Louisiana partly as a buffer against Spain, and the Spanish themselves built buffer settlements. But Georgia was Britain's most ambitious effort yet. In 1732, the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America received a royal charter. Defense was written into its DNA. The charter specifically cited the need to protect Carolina from the incursions of the savages and other enemies, as well as from the annoyance of the Spaniards. Georgia, from its inception, was a military project as much as a social one. Third, forts, towns, and military planning. The layout of a defensive colony. One of the most striking features of Georgia's early settlements was their careful, almost utopian planning. Savannah, the first town, was laid out in 1733 according to a grid of squares, with wide streets and communal green spaces. But these designs were not just aesthetic, they had a defensive logic. The layout allowed for easy movement of militia and quick assembly of townspeople in case of attack. Other settlements, such as New Ebenezer, founded by Salzburgers, and Darien, established by Scottish Highlanders, were similarly sited with defense in mind. But the most important military installation was Fort Frederica, built on St. Simon's Island in 1736. Fort Frederica, the bastion of Georgia. Fort Frederica was Georgia's military heart. Perched on a bluff overlooking the Frederica River, the fort was constructed of tabby, a concrete-like mixture of oyster shell and lime, and surrounded by a moat and earthen ramparts. Inside, a regiment of British soldiers drilled, and barracks housed both troops and settlers. The town of Frederica grew up around the fort, and its population, unlike Savannah's mix of English, German, and Jewish settlers, was heavily military. Oglethorpe himself spent much of his time at Frederica, overseeing both the defense of the colony and its diplomatic relations with native neighbors. The fort's very existence sent a message to Spain. Georgia was not an empty zone to be exploited, but a defended British outpost, ready to resist attack. Other forts and outposts, Frederica was the linchpin, but it was not the only fortification. Fort St. Andrews on Cumberland Island, Fort St. George near the Satilla River, and various smaller outposts dotted the coast and the inland trails. These forts formed a chain of defense, designed to slow or repel any Spanish advance from Florida. 4. The Spanish threat. Contest for the borderlands. The reality of danger. How real was the Spanish threat? For most of the 1730s and 1740s, the answer was very real indeed. Spanish Florida was underpopulated and militarily weak compared to British Carolina, but it was a base for raids and a rallying point for anti-British sentiment among native groups and enslaved Africans. Spanish agents actively courted native nations, seeking alliances to disrupt British settlements. Rumors of Spanish plots and papist intrigues circulated constantly in Savannah and Charleston. Meanwhile, the British Crown pressed the Trustees and Oglethorpe to keep up the pressure and vigilance. War of Jenkins Ear and the Battle of Bloody Marsh tensions came to a head in the War of Jenkins Ear, 1739-1748, a conflict sparked by commercial rivalry and personal affronts, but quickly spreading to the imperial frontier. In 1742, Spanish forces launched a major invasion of Georgia, landing on St. Simon's Island with the aim of capturing Frederica and pushing north. The most famous engagement was the Battle of Bloody Marsh in July 1742. Oglethorpe, leading a smaller force of British soldiers, Scottish Highlanders, and Creek allies, managed to ambush and rout the Spanish troops in the dense coastal forest. The Spanish retreated, and the threat to Georgia was blunted, at least for a time. While the battle was small in scale, it was immense in significance. Georgia had proved its worth as a buffer, and Oglethorpe secured his reputation as a soldier as well as a social reformer. Primary source. Spotlight, Oglethorpe's dispatch. We found the enemy posted in the woods, their numbers greatly exceeding our own, but with the aid of our Creek friends and the bravery of our Highlanders, we emerged victorious. The enemy retreated in confusion, and we remained vigilant for their return. James Oglethorpe, Letter to the Trustees, July 1742. Diplomacy with native nations, the key to survival. The central role of native alliances. Georgia's defensive success did not rest on forts alone. Just as vital, if not more so, was the colony's ability to forge alliances with the native nations who controlled the interior. The British could not hope to defend their settlements, let alone expand, without native cooperation. Here, diplomacy was as important as muskets. The Creek Confederacy and the Yamacraw. The most significant native power in the region was the Creek Confederacy, a loose alliance of towns and tribes stretching from Georgia deep into Alabama. The Creeks were skilled diplomats, adept at playing the British, Spanish, and French against one another. Their cooperation was never guaranteed. It had to be continually earned. At the local level, the Yamacraw, a small band led by the charismatic chief Tomochichi, were especially important. When Oglethorpe arrived in 1733, it was Tomochichi who welcomed him, helped him select the site for Savannah, and forged the first alliance between the British and the Creeks. Tomochichi and Mary Musgrove, diplomats of the borderland. Tomochichi quickly became one of the most remarkable figures in Georgia's early history. Despite his limited numbers, his leadership and influence were considerable. He saw in the British an opportunity to gain allies against rival native groups and to access European goods and trade. Mary Musgrove, the daughter of a Creek mother and an English father, served as the indispensable bridge between the two cultures. Fluent in both English and Muskogee, she was Oglethorpe's interpreter and advisor, negotiating treaties, smoothing misunderstandings, and facilitating trade. Their three-way partnership, Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove, formed the backbone of Georgia's early diplomacy. Primary source spotlight, Tomochichi's speech to the trustees. Here is a little present. I give it to you in token of my friendship. I trust you will be good to us and to our children. Let there be peace always between us. Tomochichi, speaking to Oglethorpe and the trustees, 1734, treaty-making and land cessions. Within months of Georgia's founding, Oglethorpe secured a series of land cessions from Tomochichi and other Creek leaders, giving the British rights to settle along the Savannah River. In return, the British offered gifts, trade goods, and promises of protection. The negotiations were often ceremonial, involving speeches, wampum belts, and elaborate rituals. Yet, these treaties were never unconditional. The Creeks expected reciprocity and continued respect for their sovereignty. The British, for their part, needed native friendship far more than they sometimes admitted. Cross-cultural diplomacy and tensions. Despite the initial goodwill, relations were never entirely smooth. Some settlers resented the limits placed on their expansion by Creek claims. Others, unused to the protocols of native diplomacy, committed blunders or gave offense. Still, as long as Oglethorpe and Tomochichi lived, the peace largely held. The British presence in Georgia was, in many ways, a negotiated one, dependent on the goodwill and strategic interests of the region's native peoples. 6. The buffer zone, in action, defense, trade, and everyday life. Militia, muster, and watchfulness. Every able-bodied settler was expected to serve in the militia. Drills were regular and weapons were kept ready. The sight of soldiers marching through Savannah-esque squares or manning the ramparts at Frederica was a daily reminder of the colony's precarious security, trade, and cultural exchange. But defense was not only about war. Trade with native nations was essential, not only for economic survival, but also for maintaining alliances. British traders, often licensed by the trustees, exchanged guns, metal tools, cloth, and rum for deerskins and other goods. Mary Musgrove herself operated a successful trading post near Savannah. These exchanges were both practical and symbolic, a way of binding the British and the Creeks together, even as both sides watched for signs of betrayal. Life on the edge. For settlers, life in Georgia was a constant balance between hope and fear. The promise of land and opportunity was shadowed by anxiety about attack, whether from Spanish soldiers, their native allies, or even disaffected neighbors. The landscape itself, swamps, dense forests, and meandering rivers, offered both protection and peril. 7. The changing balance, decline of the buffer, rise of the plantation, shifting threats and priorities. By the late 1740s, the threat from Spanish Florida had receded. The British victory at Bloody Marsh and the broader outcome of the War of Jenkins here reduced the likelihood of direct invasion. At the same time, Georgia's population was growing, and settlers were pushing for less restrictive policies, especially regarding land ownership and slavery. The end of the trustee era. In 1752, the trustees surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony. Royal governors, not idealistic trustees, now set policy. The military rationale for Georgia faded, and economic considerations, especially the expansion of plantation agriculture and the introduction of enslaved Africans, came to dominate. Georgia's buffer function was never wholly obsolete, but it was increasingly overshadowed by its role as a producer of rice, indigo, and eventually cotton. The fortifications at Frederica crumbled, and the focus shifted to wealth, not war. The legacy of diplomacy relations with native nations remained important but became more fraught as settlers encroached on Creek lands. The diplomacy of Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove gave way to conflicts and dispossession, a pattern seen throughout the American South. 8. Conclusion. Lessons from the Buffer Zone. Georgia's founding as a buffer colony is more than a footnote in colonial history. It is a lens through which we can see the entangled ambitions of empire, the realities of frontier life, and the possibilities and limits of cross-cultural diplomacy. Defense and diplomacy were two sides of the same coin. The forts and militias protected the settlements, but without the alliances and careful negotiation with native nations, Georgia would never have survived its perilous beginnings. For modern readers, the story of Georgia as a buffer colony reminds us that borders are not just lines on a map, but dynamic spaces shaped by negotiation, compromise, and sometimes conflict. The lessons of Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove, cooperation in the face of adversity, respect for difference, and the necessity of both vigilance and friendship still resonate today. Discussion questions. How did Georgia's role as a buffer colony influence its laws, society, and culture in the early years? In what ways did the success of the colony depend on Native American diplomacy as much as military strength? How did the changing nature of the Spanish threat alter Georgia's priorities and identity over time? What can we learn from the partnership between Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove about cross-cultural leadership? Further reading and primary sources. James Oglethorpe, Letters from Georgia, 1730s, 1740s. The Charter of Georgia, 1732. The Journal of Peter Gordon, an eyewitness account of early Savannah. Michael D. Green, The Creeks, a critical bibliography. Paul Presley, On the Rim of the Caribbean, Colonial Georgia and the British Atlantic World Maps and Artwork. Map of the Southern Colonies, 1733, Library of Congress. Portrait of Tomochichi and Mary Musgrove, Georgia Historical Society. Plan of the Town of Savannah, 1734. In sum, Georgia's early story was written at the crossroads of danger and diplomacy, at the intersection of empire and native sovereignty. As the last of the 13 colonies, it was both a shield against invasion and a point of contact between worlds, a legacy that continues to shape the region to this day. Settlers and survival. The early years of colonial Georgia. Introduction. A new experiment in the New World. In the early 1730s, as the British Empire looked to expand its reach and secure its southern frontier in North America, a bold social experiment was set in motion. The colony of Georgia, the last of the original 13 colonies, was founded not by a royal governor or a group of profit-seeking investors, but by a board of trustees in London. Their vision was ambitious: to create a haven for England's worthy poor, a bulwark against Spanish Florida, and a model society free from the social ills that plagued other colonies. The reality, however, would prove far more complex and challenging than the trustees ever imagined. This is the story of Georgia's first settlers, debtors and non-debtors, English, Scots, Salzburgers, Jews, and others, who braved disease, a harsh climate, agricultural failures, and supply shortages. It is also the story of how the ideals of the trustees' plan collided with the realities of colonial life, shaping the destiny of Georgia and its people. The first settlers, a mosaic of hope and hardship, the visionaries, Oglethorpe and the trustees. The founding of Georgia was the brainchild of James Edward Oglethorpe, a British member of Parliament and social reformer. Deeply moved by the plight of debtors languishing in English prisons, Oglethorpe and his associates envisioned a new colony where the deserving poor could start anew. The trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America, a group of philanthropists and politicians, were granted a royal charter in 1732, giving them authority to govern the colony for 21 years. Their plan was radical for its time. Georgia would be a place of equality, where land was distributed fairly, slavery and rum were banned, and the poor could become self-sufficient farmers. The trustees would govern from London, providing guidance and support to the settlers. Who were the first settlers? 1. Charity settlers, debtors and the poor. The original plan called for the resettlement of debtors from English prisons, but in practice, most of the first settlers were worthy poor, impoverished but skilled individuals selected for their potential to contribute to the colony. Each family received free passage, land, tools, and provisions. The trustees hoped this would relieve poverty in England and create a stable, industrious society in Georgia. 2. Persecuted Protestants, the Salzburgers and others. Georgia also became a refuge for persecuted Protestants from continental Europe. The most notable were the Salzburgers, German-speaking Lutherans expelled from the Austrian Principality of Salzburg in 1731. They arrived in 1734 and founded the town of Ebenezer, bringing with them a strong work ethic and religious devotion. Other groups included Swiss, Moravians, and various German Protestants, all drawn by the promise of religious freedom and economic opportunity. 3. Scots and Highlanders. Recognizing the need for military defense, the trustees recruited Scottish Highlanders, renowned for their martial prowess, to settle in the vulnerable southern frontier. They founded the town of Darien and played a key role in defending the colony against Spanish threats. 4. Jews and other minorities. In a remarkable act of tolerance for the time, the trustees allowed a group of Jewish settlers, 23 Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution in Portugal and Spain, to settle in Savannah in 1733. They quickly became integral to the community, with Dr. Samuel Nunes, a Jewish physician, credited with saving many lives during an early epidemic. 5. Adventurers and self-funded immigrants. Not all settlers were charity recipients. Some paid their own way, motivated by the prospect of land and opportunity. These adventurers added to the colony's diversity and brought valuable skills and resources. 6. Indigenous peoples. While not settlers, the presence and influence of indigenous groups, particularly the Yamakra, led by Tomochichi, were crucial. Early relations were shaped by negotiation and cooperation, especially in the founding of Savannah. 2. Hardships, disease, climate, agriculture, and supplies. The land of promise and peril. The trustees' vision of a prosperous, egalitarian society quickly ran aground on the shoals of reality. The first settlers arrived in a land that was beautiful but unforgiving, and survival was anything but guaranteed. 1. Disease and death. The subtropical climate of coastal Georgia was a breeding ground for disease. Malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery claimed many lives. Of the original 144 colonists, nearly 1 in 3 died soon after arrival. The Salzburgers, in particular, recorded harrowing accounts of illness and death during their first years. The first colonists faced endless days of hard work and bad water. They endured heat and mosquitoes and malaria. 2. Food shortages and agricultural struggles. Food insecurity was a constant threat. The settlers, unfamiliar with the local climate and soil, struggled to grow crops. The trustees had high hopes for silk and wine production, but these ventures largely failed due to unsuitable conditions and lack of expertise. The colony's early years were marked by hunger and malnutrition. 3. Labor and land restrictions. The trustees' ban on slavery and limits on land ownership, intended to promote equality, instead created labor shortages and stifled economic growth. Settlers found it difficult to clear land and cultivate crops without sufficient labor, and many chafed at the inability to buy, sell, or inherit land freely. 4. Supply shortages and isolation. The colony was dependent on supplies from England, which were often delayed or inadequate. Tools, seeds, and other essentials were in short supply, and the settlers had to make do with what they had. The journey to Georgia itself was perilous, with many dying or arriving, weakened by poor rations and harsh conditions. 5. Hostile neighbors and external threats. Georgia's location made it a target for Spanish attacks from Florida. The threat of invasion was ever present, and the need for defense shaped the colony's development. 6. high mortality and demographic challenges. By 1752, around a third of the original settlers had died, most from disease, malnutrition, or the rigors of the journey and settlement. The trustees' plan for a balanced, stable population was undermined by these losses. Third, daily life, adaptation and community building, a new society. Despite the hardships, the settlers persevered. Daily life was a constant struggle, but also a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. 1. Skills and labor. Settlers had to master a wide range of skills: clearing land, building shelters, hunting, fishing, and farming. Women played a crucial role, managing households, tending gardens, and caring for children. Community organization was strict, with labor divided and overseen by appointed leaders. 2. Social structure and governance. The trustees imposed strict rules: no slavery, no rum, no representative assembly. Settlers were expected to live in compact, organized townships for defense and social control. The lack of self-government was a major source of discontent. 3. Religion and community life. Religious observance was central, especially among groups like the Salzburgers. Churches and communal gatherings provided spiritual support and a sense of belonging. The diversity of the population, English, Scots, Germans, Jews, created a rich tapestry of traditions and customs. 4. Relations with Native Americans. James Oglethorpe's diplomacy with local tribes, especially the Yamacraw, was crucial. Trade and cooperation helped ensure the colony's survival, though tensions and conflicts were never far below the surface. 5. Economic activities. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy, but trade with Native Americans and attempts at silk production were also important. The Indian trade, in particular, provided a vital source of income. The realities versus the ideals of the trustees' plan. The trustees' utopian vision. The trustees' plan for Georgia was shaped by Enlightenment ideals and a desire to avoid the problems of other colonies. Their goals included creating a haven for the worthy poor and persecuted Protestants, establishing a society of small farmers, free from slavery and large plantations, prohibiting rum and large landholdings, governing the colony directly from London, with no local representative government, the collision with reality. 1. Governance and representation. The trustees' remote governance quickly led to dissatisfaction. Settlers felt powerless to influence decisions affecting their lives. By 1750, mounting pressure forced the trustees to allow a local representative assembly, and when Georgia became a royal colony in 1754, a more conventional government was established. 2. Land ownership and economic policy. Strict limits on land ownership were deeply unpopular. Settlers wanted the freedom to buy, sell, and inherit land. Over time, the trustees relaxed these restrictions, allowing larger holdings and more economic freedom. Slavery. The ban on slavery was intended to promote equality, but many settlers saw it as an obstacle to prosperity. Persistent lobbying led the trustees to lift the ban in 1750, fundamentally changing the colony's social and economic structure. 4. Alcohol, rum, prohibition. The ban on rum was widely ignored and eventually lifted. Settlers smuggled rum into the colony, and enforcement proved impossible. 5. Demographic and social composition. The trustees envisioned a homogeneous, industrious society, but the reality was a diverse, often discontented population. Many settlers left Georgia for other colonies or Britain due to dissatisfaction with the trustees' rules. Communities and settlements, the patchwork of early Georgia. Savannah, the planned capital. Founded in 1733 by Oglethorpe and the first group of settlers, Savannah was carefully planned with a grid layout and public squares. It quickly became the administrative and economic center of the colony, home to a diverse population including English, German, and Jewish settlers. Ebenezer, the Salzburgers' refuge. The Salzburgers, German-speaking Protestants, founded Ebenezer north of Savannah. Known for their industriousness and self-reliance, they built a prosperous community and the New Jerusalem Church, the oldest brick structure in Georgia. Fort Frederica, the military outpost. Established on St. Simon's Island, Fort Frederica was a military outpost defending against Spanish incursions. It played a crucial role in the colony's defense, especially during the Battle of Bloody Marsh. Darien, the Scottish Highlanders settlement. Founded by Scottish Highlanders, Darien was the southernmost and most vulnerable settlement. The Highlanders played a key role in defending Georgia from Spanish threats and brought a distinct cultural influence. Brunswick and Augusta, trade and expansion. Brunswick, established as a port city, and Augusta, founded as a military outpost and trade center, were important for the colony's economic and territorial expansion. Sixth, the end of the Trustee era. Adaptation and transformation. By the early 1750s, the Trustees experiment was unraveling. The realities of disease, labor shortages, economic competition, and settler discontent forced a series of concessions. The ban on slavery was lifted, landholding rules were relaxed, and local government was established. In 1752, the Trustees surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony. The colony's transformation was swift. Plantations and enslaved labor became the norm, and Georgia's economy began to resemble that of its southern neighbors. The egalitarian society envisioned by the Trustees gave way to a more stratified, plantation-based system. 7. Legacy. Lessons from the early years. The early years of Georgia were marked by hardship, adaptation, and the collision of ideals with reality. The Trustees' vision was noble, but perhaps naive in the face of the challenges of colonial life. Yet their experiment left a lasting legacy. Georgia's diverse population, English, Scots, Salzburgers, Jews, and others, created a rich cultural tapestry. The early emphasis on equality and philanthropy, though ultimately abandoned, set Georgia apart from its inception. The struggles and adaptations of the first settlers laid the foundation for the colony's later growth and prosperity. The story of Georgia's early years is a testament to the resilience of its settlers and the enduring tension between utopian ideals and the demands of survival. Conclusion: survival and change. The founding of Georgia was one of the most ambitious social experiments in colonial America. The Trustees' plan, shaped by philanthropy, economic ambition, and strategic necessity, offered hope to the poor and persecuted. But the realities of disease, climate, agricultural failure, and political discontent forced a transformation that neither the Trustees nor the first settlers could have foreseen. In the end, it was the settlers' ability to adapt, to learn from hardship, to build communities, and to demand change that ensured Georgia's survival. Their story is not just one of struggle, but of endurance, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of a better life in a new world. The evolution of slavery and labor in colonial Georgia, from utopian ideals to plantation reality. Introduction. The story of colonial Georgia is a tale of grand social experiments, ideological battles, and the relentless force of economic reality. Founded in 1732 as the last of the original 13 British colonies, Georgia was envisioned as a beacon of reform, a place where England's worthy poor could start anew, where small farmers would thrive, and where the blight of slavery would be banished. Yet, within 2 decades, these ideals would be swept aside by the powerful currents of economic necessity and settler pressure, transforming Georgia into a plantation colony deeply reliant on enslaved labor. This blog post traces the evolution of slavery and labor in colonial Georgia from its initial ban and ideological roots through the mounting economic pressures and settler campaigns for enslaved labor to the lifting of the ban and Georgia's rapid transformation into a slave society. The founding of Georgia. Utopian ideals and the ban on slavery. A. The vision of the trustees. Georgia's founding was unlike that of any other southern colony. Led by James Oglethorpe and a group of trustees in England, the colony was conceived as a social experiment, a place where the poor and indebted could find redemption through honest labor, and where the social ills of England's class system and the southern plantation aristocracy would be avoided. The trustees' vision was shaped by several key principles: humanitarian and social reform. The colony would offer a fresh start for England's poor, especially debtors, providing them with land and the opportunity for self-sufficiency. Small farming and social equality. Large land holdings were banned, and land was distributed in small plots to prevent the rise of a landed elite and to encourage a society of independent farmers. Religious freedom. With the exception of Catholics, religious freedom was granted, attracting a diverse array of settlers, including Jews and Protestants from across Europe. B. The ideological roots of the slavery ban. Perhaps the most radical aspect of Georgia's founding was its explicit ban on slavery. At a time when the economies of neighboring colonies like South Carolina and Virginia were booming on the backs of enslaved Africans, Georgia's trustees took a stand that was both ideological and practical. 1. Moral and religious arguments. James Oglethorpe, the colony's leading founder, was a vocal opponent of slavery. He believed that slavery was against the gospel as well as the fundamental law of England, and that it would bring misery not only to Africans, but also to the moral fabric of the colony. The trustees saw slavery as incompatible with their vision of a virtuous, industrious society of small farmers. 2. Humanitarian and social concerns. The trustees feared that slavery would lead to the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a few, undermining the egalitarian society they hoped to build. They also worried about the potential for slave revolts and the security risks posed by a large enslaved population, especially given Georgia's role as a buffer against Spanish Florida. 3. Enlightenment ideals. The ban on slavery was also rooted in Enlightenment thinking, which emphasized reason, equality, and the potential for social improvement. The trustees believed that free labor would encourage industriousness and self-sufficiency, and that a society without slavery would be more just and stable. C. The early years, labor and economic challenges. Despite these lofty ideals, the reality on the ground in Georgia was far more complicated. The colony's ban on slavery, combined with restrictions on land ownership and the limited availability of indentured servants, created significant labor shortages. Settlers struggled to clear land, plant crops, and build the infrastructure needed for the colony's survival. 2. Economic pressures and the push for enslaved labor. A. The limits of free labor. Georgia's climate and fertile soil were well suited for labor-intensive cash crops like rice and indigo. However, without access to enslaved labor, settlers found it nearly impossible to compete with the large plantations of South Carolina, where enslaved Africans provided the backbone of the economy. 1. Labor shortages. The trustees' ban on slavery meant that all agricultural work had to be done by free settlers or indentured servants. Many of the original settlers were poor, unaccustomed to the harsh realities of frontier farming, and unable to provide the labor needed for large-scale agriculture. The result was chronic labor shortages and limited crop production. 2. Economic stagnation. As a result, Georgia's economy lagged far behind its neighbors. While South Carolina's rice and indigo plantations generated immense wealth, Georgia's small farms struggled to survive. The inability to exploit the most profitable crops led to widespread dissatisfaction among settlers, many of whom had migrated from other colonies and were accustomed to the economic advantages of slave labor. B. Settler grievances and petitions. The economic frustrations of Georgia's settlers soon boiled over into organized campaigns for change. Throughout the 1740s, settlers in Savannah and other lowland areas began to petition the trustees for the introduction of slavery. 1. Pro-slavery petitions. Settlers argued that without access to enslaved labor, they could not achieve economic success or even sustain their farms. They pointed to the prosperity of South Carolina and threatened to abandon Georgia for colonies where slavery was permitted. These petitions often included economic data and comparisons to neighboring colonies, making a compelling case for the repeal of the ban. 2. The Darien Petition, a dissenting voice. Not all settlers supported the introduction of slavery. In 1739, the Scottish Highlanders of Darien, New Inverness, submitted a petition urging the trustees to maintain the ban, arguing that slavery would undermine the colony's social and economic development. However, their voices were soon drowned out by the majority of settlers who saw slavery as essential to Georgia's survival. C. The Trustees' Dilemma. The trustees faced mounting pressure from colonists, merchants, and planters who wanted to introduce slavery. The debates were intense and multifaceted. Economic arguments. Proponents of slavery argued that the ban was stifling Georgia's growth and making it impossible to compete with other southern colonies. Moral and security concerns. Opponents, including some trustees and religious groups, warned that introducing slavery would undermine the colony's founding ideals and could lead to social instability and potential slave revolts. Pragmatic considerations. Some trustees, while personally opposed to slavery, recognized that the colony's survival was at stake and that continued resistance to the settlers' demands could lead to the collapse of the Georgia experiment. 3. The lifting of the ban and Georgia's transformation. The end of the experiment. By 1750, the economic arguments for slavery had become overwhelming. The trustees, unable to stem the tide of settler petitions and facing the prospect of the colony's failure, petitioned Parliament to end the ban. In 1751, slavery was officially permitted in Georgia. B. The immediate aftermath. The lifting of the ban marked a turning point in Georgia's history. Planters from South Carolina quickly moved in, bringing enslaved laborers and establishing rice and indigo plantations. Georgia's economy was rapidly transformed, and the colony soon resembled its southern neighbors in both economic structure and social hierarchy. 1. The rise of plantation agriculture. With the introduction of slavery, Georgia rapidly adopted the plantation model. Enslaved Africans became the backbone of the labor force, especially in the cultivation of rice in the coastal lowlands, and later cotton in the interior. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney in nearby Savannah revolutionized cotton processing and entrenched slavery even further in Georgia's economic and social fabric. 2. Expansion of the slave economy. The demand for enslaved labor soared as planters sought to maximize profits from cotton and rice. By 1860, enslaved people made up nearly 44% of Georgia's population, with the majority working on cotton plantations. The forced removal of Native American tribes, Cherokee and Creek, opened vast tracts of land for white settlement and plantation agriculture, further fueling the expansion of slavery. 3. Integration into global markets. Georgia's slave-based economy was deeply intertwined with national and international markets. Cotton harvested by enslaved laborers was shipped to textile mills in the north and to England, feeding the global industrial revolution. Banks, insurance companies, and shipping lines in both the South and North profited immensely from the slave economy, with enslaved people often used as collateral for loans and as insured property. C. Social transformation. 1. Entrenchment of white supremacy. The introduction and rapid expansion of slavery entrenched a rigid racial hierarchy in Georgia. White Georgians, regardless of class, came to view slavery as economically indispensable and as a foundation of social order. Pro-slavery ideology gained prominence, portraying slavery as a positive good and a necessary component of Southern society. 2. Displacement and trauma. The domestic slave trade, especially after the 1808 ban on the international slave trade, led to the forced migration of thousands of enslaved people into Georgia. Families were routinely separated, and the trauma of displacement became a defining feature of enslaved life. Major cities like Savannah and Augusta became hubs for the sale and distribution of enslaved people. Cultural resistance and community. Despite overwhelming oppression, enslaved Georgians developed resilient communities, preserving African traditions, language, and spiritual practices. The Gullah Geechee people on the coastal islands, for example, maintained distinct cultural identities that provided strength and resistance to the dehumanizing system. 4. Social stratification. The plantation system created a powerful planter elite, but also left many white Georgians landless or working as overseers and small farmers. The economic and social gap between wealthy planters and poor whites widened, though both groups were invested in maintaining the racial order of V. Georgia in the Southern context, comparison and consequences, A. Georgia's unique beginnings. Unlike other Southern colonies, Georgia was founded with a ban on slavery and large landholdings, setting it apart from the established plantation economies of Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. The trustees' initial vision was rooted in Enlightenment ideals and humanitarian concerns, but these restrictions soon led to economic challenges. B. The shift to a plantation economy. Once the ban on slavery was lifted, Georgia quickly adopted the plantation model. Large-scale cultivation of rice and later cotton became the economic backbone, mirroring the economies of South Carolina and Virginia. The importation of enslaved Africans increased dramatically, transforming Georgia's demographic and social landscape. C. Economic and social parity. The transition allowed Georgia to achieve economic parity with its neighbors, as plantation agriculture proved highly profitable. The colony became integrated into the Atlantic economy, exporting agricultural products through ports like Savannah and Charleston. A wealthy planter class emerged, dominating politics, society, and the economy. D. The legacy of slavery. The economic and social structures established during the era of slavery persisted long after emancipation. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced slavery in practice, binding black Georgians to the land and to cycles of debt. Racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence continued to shape Georgia's society well into the 20th century. Primary sources and first-hand accounts understanding. Georgia's transition from a slavery ban to a slave society relies on a wealth of primary sources: official correspondence, settler petitions, government records, diaries, and contemporary newspapers. These documents provide invaluable first-hand perspectives on the debates, economic pressures, and social changes that accompanied the lifting of the slavery ban and the subsequent development of Georgia as a slave society. Trustees' correspondence and minutes, letters and official records from the trustees, including James Oglethorpe, discussing the rationale for the slavery ban and the debates leading up to its repeal. Settler petitions, documents submitted by Georgia colonists to the trustees, arguing for the introduction of slavery to address labor shortages and economic challenges. Government proclamations, official announcements regarding changes in colonial policy, including the 1750 decision to lift the ban on slavery. Contemporary newspapers, articles and advertisements reflecting the economic and social changes as slavery was introduced. Personal diaries and letters, first-hand accounts from settlers and officials describing daily life, labor conditions, and the impact of the transition on Georgia society. Many of these sources are now digitized and available online through university libraries, the Library of Congress, and state archives, offering researchers and students direct insight into this pivotal period in Georgia's history. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of Georgia's labor evolution. The evolution of slavery and labor in colonial Georgia is a story of ideals tested by reality. The trustees' vision of a free, egalitarian society was ultimately undone by the economic imperatives of the colonial South. The ban on slavery, rooted in humanitarian and Enlightenment ideals, could not withstand the pressures of labor shortages, economic stagnation, and settler demands for prosperity. The lifting of the ban in 1750 marked Georgia's transformation into a plantation colony, aligning it with its southern neighbors and entrenching a system of racial hierarchy and exploitation that would shape the state for generations. The wealth and power of Georgia's planter elite were built on the backs of enslaved Africans, whose resilience and resistance laid the groundwork for future struggles for freedom and justice. Today, the legacy of this transformation is still felt in Georgia's social, economic, and political landscape. The story of colonial Georgia serves as a powerful reminder of the complex interplay between ideology, economics, and human agency in shaping the course of history and of the enduring consequences of choices made in the pursuit of prosperity. Georgia in the British imperial system, a colonial nexus. Introduction: Georgia's place in the grand imperial design. The founding of Georgia in 1732 marked the final chapter in Britain's establishment of its 13 North American colonies. While Georgia is often remembered for its philanthropic origins and social experiments, its true significance within the British Empire was as a linchpin in imperial strategy, a buffer against rival European powers, a source of raw materials, and a participant in the Atlantic world's complex web of trade and defense. This blog explores Georgia's multifaceted role in the British imperial system, focusing on its strategic, economic, and political functions, and its evolving relationships with London and its fellow American colonies. Imperial strategy, trade, defense, and the triangular economy. A. Georgia as a strategic buffer. 1. Defense against Spanish and French threats. Georgia's founding was driven by the British need to secure their southern frontier. The colony's location, directly north of Spanish Florida, made it a critical buffer zone. The British Crown and Parliament saw Georgia as a protective barrier for the more prosperous South Carolina, which was vulnerable to Spanish incursions and influence. The construction of military outposts, such as Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island, and the recruitment of Scottish Highlanders for settlement in Darien, underscored Georgia's defensive role. The Battle of Bloody Marsh in 1742, where Oglethorpe's forces repelled a Spanish invasion, was a defining moment that validated Georgia's strategic purpose. 2. Protection of the Carolina Low Country. South Carolina's wealth, generated by rice and indigo plantations, was vital to the British Empire. Georgia's existence provided a crucial layer of protection for these economic assets, safeguarding trade routes and plantations from foreign attack and potential slave uprisings incited by Spanish agents. B. Economic contributions to the mercantile system. 1. Diversification of raw materials. The trustees envisioned Georgia as a producer of commodities Britain imported from rivals: silk, wine, and olive oil. While these ventures largely failed due to climate and expertise issues, the ambition reflected Georgia's intended role in imperial trade. 2. Naval stores and timber. Georgia's forests supplied naval stores, tar, pitch, turpentine, and timber, essential for the Royal Navy and British shipping. These products were in high demand and helped maintain Britain's maritime supremacy. 3. Indigo and rice, post-slavery ban. After the ban on slavery was lifted in 1750, Georgia rapidly adopted a plantation economy, producing lucrative cash crops like indigo and rice. These commodities were highly valued in Britain and contributed significantly to the imperial economy, further integrating Georgia into the mercantile system. C. The triangular trade and Atlantic economy. 1. Imports from Britain. Georgia imported British manufactured goods, textiles, tools, firearms, and luxury items in exchange for its raw materials, reinforcing the mercantile relationship. 2. Exports to Britain and the Caribbean. Georgia's agricultural products, initially timber and naval stores, later rice and indigo, were shipped to Britain. The colony also exported provisions and timber to the British Caribbean, which relied on mainland colonies for food and building materials. 3. The transatlantic slave trade. After 1750, Georgia became a direct participant in the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were brought to labor on plantations, a brutal but economically central component of the Atlantic economy. This human cargo was exchanged for rum, manufactured goods, and other commodities, completing the triangle. Du. 2. Georgia's role in the Southern economy and the Atlantic world. A. Integration with the Southern colonies. 1. Economic competition and cooperation. Initially, Georgia struggled to compete with South Carolina's established plantation economy due to restrictions on slavery and landholding. Once these restrictions were lifted, Georgia's economic model converged with South Carolina's, focusing on large-scale production of rice and indigo. This led to both competition for markets and cooperation in defense and trade. 2. Shared labor systems. The adoption of enslaved labor cemented Georgia's place within the Southern slave society. Legal codes, social structures, and racial hierarchies in Georgia mirrored those in other southern colonies, creating a shared regional identity. 3. Intercolonial trade. Georgia engaged in significant intercolonial trade, exchanging its products for goods from other colonies. For example, it supplied timber and provisions to the Caribbean and received rum and molasses in return. B. Connections to the wider Atlantic world. 1. European immigration. Georgia attracted diverse European immigrant groups, Salzburgers, Scots, Swiss, and others, who brought their own cultures, skills, and connections, making Georgia a microcosm of broader European migration patterns. 2. Indigenous trade networks. Georgia was part of extensive indigenous trade networks. European goods, particularly firearms and textiles, were exchanged for deerskins and other furs, integrating Georgia into a system that stretched far into the North American interior. This trade was crucial for the colony's early survival and diplomatic relations with Native American nations like the Creek and Cherokee. 3. Imperial Wars. Georgia was a front line in the imperial wars between Britain, Spain, and France. Conflicts like the War of Jenkins' Ear and the French and Indian War directly impacted the colony, shaping its military development and relationship with the Crown. 3. The colony's relationship with London and the other American colonies. A. The relationship with London, from trusteeship to royal colony. 1. Trusteeship. 1732–1752. Georgia was governed by a Board of Trustees in London, with Oglethorpe as resident trustee. This direct control meant London exerted significant influence over every aspect of colonial life, from land distribution to labor policies. The trustees' utopian ideals often clashed with the realities on the ground, leading to friction with settlers who desired more autonomy and economic freedom. 2. Royal Colony, 1752–1776. By 1752, the trustees, facing mounting settler discontent and economic struggles, surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony. This brought Georgia more in line with other British colonies, with a royal governor appointed by the Crown, an elected assembly, and a more conventional system of governance. This shift allowed for greater local self-governance, though ultimate authority still rested with Parliament and the King. 3. Imperial oversight and taxation. As a royal colony, Georgia was subject to British imperial policies, including trade regulations, navigation acts, and eventually taxation measures like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. These policies, designed to benefit the mother country, often generated resentment among colonists who felt their economic interests were being subordinated to those of Britain. B. Relationship with other American colonies. 1. Dependence on South Carolina. In its early years, Georgia was heavily dependent on South Carolina for supplies, trade, and military support. Many of Georgia's early settlers came from South Carolina, bringing with them their economic practices and social expectations, including the desire for enslaved labor, shared grievances, and growing unity. As British imperial policies became more restrictive after the French and Indian War, Georgia, like other colonies, began to experience shared grievances. While initially more cautious due to its reliance on British subsidies and its vulnerable frontier, Georgia eventually joined the growing movement for colonial rights. Participation in continental congresses. Georgia sent delegates to the continental congresses, participating in the intercolonial discussions and decisions that led to the American Revolution. Though its participation was sometimes delayed or less enthusiastic than that of older, more established colonies, it ultimately cast its lot with the other colonies in declaring independence. 4. Economic ties and rivalries. Economic ties, particularly in the southern agricultural economy, fostered a sense of regional identity among Georgia and its neighbors. However, there were also rivalries, particularly over land claims and trade routes, which sometimes led to disputes. The impact of imperial policies on Georgia. Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were a series of English laws that restricted colonial trade to benefit the mother country. Georgia, like other colonies, was required to ship certain enumerated goods, like rice, indigo, and naval stores, exclusively to Britain or other British colonies, even if better prices could be found elsewhere. This ensured that Britain controlled the flow of valuable raw materials and reaped the profits from their processing and resale. B. Salutary neglect and its end. For much of the early 18th century, Britain practiced a policy of salutary neglect, loosely enforcing imperial laws as long as the colonies remained economically loyal. This allowed colonies like Georgia a degree of de facto autonomy. However, after the costly French and Indian War, 1754-1763, Britain ended salutary neglect, imposing new taxes and stricter controls to pay off its war debt and assert greater authority over its colonies. This shift directly contributed to the growing tensions that led to the Revolution. C. Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763, issued after the French and Indian War, prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. While intended to prevent conflict with Native Americans and reduce imperial expenses, it angered many colonists, including Georgians, who saw it as an infringement on their right to expand westward and access new lands. D. Taxation without representation. Like other colonies, Georgia protested British attempts to impose taxes, e.g. the Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, without colonial representation in Parliament. While Georgia's response was sometimes more muted due to its dependence on British protection and subsidies, the principle of no taxation without representation resonated deeply. V. Georgia on the eve of revolution. By the 1770s, Georgia was a rapidly growing, prosperous royal colony, deeply integrated into the British imperial system. Its economy was thriving on rice and indigo. Its population was expanding, and its strategic importance remained high. However, the increasing assertiveness of British imperial policy, coupled with the growing spirit of independence among its sister colonies, forced Georgians to confront their allegiance. The decision to join the revolution was not unanimous and was fraught with internal divisions between loyalists and patriots. Yet, ultimately, the desire for self-governance, economic autonomy, and a shared sense of American identity prevailed, leading Georgia to cast its lot with the other colonies in the fight for independence. Conclusion: a legacy of imperial influence. Georgia's journey from a philanthropic experiment to a royal colony deeply embedded in the British imperial system is a testament to the powerful forces of geopolitics, economics, and human ambition. Its role as a strategic buffer, a supplier of raw materials, and a participant in the Atlantic economy shaped its development in profound ways. The imperial strategy of trade and defense dictated much of Georgia's early existence, while its integration into the southern economy and the wider Atlantic world defined its economic and social structure. The complex relationship with London, evolving from direct trusteeship to royal oversight, and its growing ties with other American colonies, ultimately set the stage for its participation in the American Revolution. Understanding Georgia's place within the British Empire is crucial for comprehending not only its own colonial history, but also the broader dynamics that led to the birth of the United States. It highlights how even the most idealistic colonial ventures were ultimately shaped by the grand designs and intricate workings of a global imperial power. Facing change. The end of the trustee period in colonial Georgia. Introduction and experiments twilight. When Georgia's first settlers arrived in 1733, they were stepping into the most ambitious social experiment the British Empire had ever attempted in North America. Guided by the vision of James Oglethorpe and the Board of Trustees, the colony was to be a haven for the worthy poor, a bulwark against Spanish invasion, and a model of moral and economic reform. For 2 decades, the trustees clung to ideals of equality, sobriety, and opportunity. But by the early 1750s, the grand experiment was unraveling. Oglethorpe was gone, the settlers were restless, and the colony's future lay not in London's philanthropic salons, but in the hands of royal officials and the demands of the Atlantic world. This is the story of how the trustees' utopian vision collapsed, how Georgia was transformed into a royal colony, and how a host of social, economic, and demographic changes swept through the province, leaving it forever altered. I. Oglethorpe's departure, the beginning of the end. The visionary leaves. James Oglethorpe was the beating heart of early Georgia, a reformer, general, and the only trustee ever to set foot in the colony he helped create. His leadership was hands-on, charismatic, and at times autocratic. He negotiated with native leaders, designed Savannah's grid, enforced the ban on slavery, and led troops against the Spanish at the Battle of Bloody Marsh. But Oglethorpe was also a polarizing figure, and by the early 1740s his influence was waning. In 1743, after a decade in Georgia, Oglethorpe left for England, never to return. His departure marked the beginning of the end for the trustees' direct engagement with the colony. Without his vision and personal authority, the trustees in London became increasingly detached from the on-the-ground realities of colonial life. The ideals begin to fray. The trustees' founding ideals, equality, small landholdings, bans on slavery and rum, and a paternalistic governance from London, had always been at odds with the desires of many settlers. Oglethorpe's departure left a leadership vacuum. Local discontent, previously held in check by his presence, began to boil over. The settlers, facing disease, economic stagnation, and a sense of powerlessness, demanded change. 2. The collapse of a utopian vision. The trustees' ideals. The trustees had imagined Georgia as a society of small farmers, free of slavery, large landowners, and the vices of urban England. Their rules were strict. Landholdings were limited to 500 acres, later 2,000, with no right to sell or bequeath land to daughters. Slavery was banned to prevent the rise of a planter aristocracy. Rum and other hard liquors were prohibited. The colony had no elected assembly. Governance was directed from London. Religious toleration was extended, except to Catholics due to fears of Spanish influence. The realities on the ground. From the outset, the trustees' rules ran into trouble. The soil and climate of coastal Georgia were poorly suited to European crops. Silk and wine, intended as staple exports, failed to thrive. Without enslaved labor, settlers struggled to clear land and turn a profit in agriculture, especially as neighboring South Carolina prospered with rice and indigo plantations. The ban on land sales and inheritance discouraged investment and stifled population growth. Meanwhile, the ban on rum was widely ignored and difficult to enforce. The absence of an elected assembly left colonists feeling voiceless, fueling resentment and, at times, open protest. Growing dissent. By the late 1740s, the colony's population was stagnant, the economy weak, and the trustees' authority increasingly challenged. Petitions to London demanded the right to own slaves, expand landholdings, and form an assembly. Many settlers left for Carolina or returned to Britain, disillusioned with the trustees' promises. 3. The transition to royal colony status, 1752, the surrender of the charter. Facing mounting pressure, declining morale, and a lack of success, the trustees reluctantly yielded to reality. In 1752, after 20 years, they surrendered their charter to the crown. Georgia became a royal colony, governed directly by the king's appointed governor and, eventually, its own elected assembly. Immediate changes. With the transition came swift reforms. Land laws, property restrictions were eased. Land could now be bought, sold, and inherited more freely. Slavery. The ban on slavery had already been lifted in 1750. Under royal rule, the plantation system spread rapidly. Rum and trade. Restrictions on rum and trade were relaxed, integrating Georgia more fully into the Atlantic economy. Government. The colony gained a governor, a council, and by 1754, a Commons House of Assembly, giving settlers a say in their own affairs. The end of the trustees' era. The trustees' utopian project was effectively over. Georgia was now on a path similar to its southern neighbors, shaped by the forces of plantation agriculture, slavery, and the market economy. 4. Social shifts. From philanthropy to plantation, a new elite emerges. The original vision of a society of equal smallholders faded as wealth, land, and political power became concentrated in the hands of a new planter elite. Many of these new leaders were immigrants from South Carolina and other colonies, drawn by the promise of land and the newly legal status of slavery. The expansion of slavery. The lifting of the slave ban in 1750 marked a turning point. Enslaved Africans became the backbone of Georgia's economy, laboring on rice, indigo, and later cotton plantations. The demographics of the colony shifted rapidly, with the enslaved population soon outnumbering free settlers in some regions. A more stratified society. With the rise of plantations came a more hierarchical society. The small, relatively egalitarian community envisioned by the trustees gave way to a system marked by sharp divisions of race, class, and wealth. Planters dominated politics and society, while small farmers, artisans, and the enslaved formed lower tiers. The role of women and families. Women's roles changed as well. Under the trustees, women could not inherit land, but royal governance slowly expanded their legal and economic rights, especially among the upper classes. Family structures became more diverse, with a growing number of mixed-race children born under slavery, some of whom would play important roles in Georgia's future. Economic transformation, from struggle to prosperity. The rise of the plantation. Economy, royal rule, and the expansion of slavery unlocked Georgia's economic potential. Large-scale rice and indigo plantations flourished along the coast and river deltas. The export of these crops tied Georgia firmly into the Atlantic world, bringing wealth to planters and integrating the colony into Britain's mercantile system. Urban development. Savannah, founded as a compact planned city, grew rapidly as a commercial hub. Brunswick, Augusta, and other settlements expanded, driven by trade, shipping, and the growing demand for plantation goods. Trade and the Atlantic world. Georgia's ports bustled with activity. British ships brought manufactured goods, while Georgia exported rice, indigo, timber, and deerskins. The colony also traded with the Caribbean and other North American colonies, becoming a vital node in the imperial trade network. The dark side. The slave trade. With prosperity came tragedy. The slave trade became central to Georgia's economy, and the colony became a major market for enslaved Africans. The human cost was immense, with generations of African-descended people subjected to forced labor, violence, and family separation. Demographic shifts, growth, diversity, and displacement. Population growth. Georgia's population, stagnant under the trustees, boomed under royal rule. The promise of land and the legalization of slavery attracted settlers from across the British Atlantic. English, Scots-Irish, Germans, and Africans, both free and enslaved. Rural and urban migration. The expansion of plantations drew settlers further inland and upriver, pushing the boundaries of colonial Georgia. Urban centers like Savannah grew, with a cosmopolitan mix of merchants, artisans, and laborers. Indigenous displacement. As new lands were claimed and settled, indigenous peoples, particularly the Creek and Cherokee, were increasingly displaced. Treaties were signed, broken, and renegotiated, and native communities were pushed westward. The struggle for land and sovereignty would define Georgia's relationship with native nations for decades to come. The changing face of the colony. By the eve of the American Revolution, Georgia was a far cry from the trustees' model colony. Its population was larger, more diverse, and more deeply divided by race and class. The largest demographic shifts were driven by the arrival of enslaved Africans, the influx of planters and merchants, and the displacement of native peoples. Seventh, the political evolution. From subjects to citizens, the rise of local government. The creation of the Commons House of Assembly gave Georgians a measure of self-government. Planters and merchants dominated this body, shaping laws to suit their interests. Political factionalism. As in other colonies, political life in Georgia became increasingly contentious. Rival factions vied for power, often divided by regional interests, coastal elite versus backcountry settlers, economic priorities, and attitudes toward British authority. The growth of colonial identity. The experience of self-government, economic expansion, and shared grievances against imperial policies fostered a sense of colonial identity. By the 1760s, Georgia was increasingly aligned with the other American colonies, participating in resistance to British taxes and sending delegates to the Continental Congress. 8. The legacy of the trustee period, what remained? Not all of the trustees' ideals vanished. Their emphasis on religious toleration, except for Catholics, urban planning, the unique layout of Savannah, and public charity left a mark on Georgia's culture. The early years produced a tradition of civic engagement and public debate that persisted even as the colony became more hierarchical. Lessons learned. The utopianism of the trustees, while admirable, was ultimately unsustainable in the face of economic reality, settler preferences, and imperial pressures. Their experiment, like so many in colonial America, was reshaped by the demands and desires of those who actually lived in Georgia. Seeds of change. The end of the trustee period did not mean an end to change. The social, economic, and demographic shifts set in motion by the transition to royal rule prepared Georgia for its role in the coming American Revolution. The colony's embrace of plantation agriculture and slavery tied it to global markets, while its political development and demographic diversity shaped its identity as one of the most dynamic and conflicted of the original 13 colonies. Conclusion. From utopia to reality. The story of Georgia's trustee period is a story of ideals meeting the hard edge of reality. Oglethorpe's departure symbolized the end of direct engagement, the collapse of the trustees' authority, and the colony's transition to a new era. The shift to royal colony status in 1752 brought prosperity and growth, but also inequality, slavery, and displacement. In the process, Georgia was transformed from a social experiment into a thriving, but deeply divided colony at the heart of the British Atlantic world. The legacies of the trustee period, both good and ill, would shape Georgia's future and continue to echo in its history for generations to come. Economic pressures and legalization. Despite the trustees' intentions, economic pressures and settler demands quickly eroded the ban on slavery. Settlers argued that they could not compete with neighboring South Carolina, where enslaved labor fueled economic prosperity. By 1751, slavery was officially legalized in Georgia, and the colony rapidly adopted the plantation model, the growth of slavery and its consequences. Once legalized, the institution of slavery expanded rapidly. By the time of the American Revolution, Georgia's enslaved population had grown to 18,000. The shift to plantation agriculture entrenched a rigid social hierarchy, with a small elite of wealthy planters dominating economic, political, and social life. Enslaved Africans faced brutal conditions, family separation, and the constant threat of violence long-term impact. The introduction of slavery fundamentally altered Georgia's society and economy, aligning it with the rest of the southern colonies and setting the stage for its later role in the Cotton Kingdom and the American Civil War. See settlers, diversity, discontent, and adaptation. A mosaic of settlers. Georgia's early settlers were a diverse group, including English, Scots, German Salzburgers, Jews, and other Europeans. The trustees deliberately sought a balanced mix of men, women, and children to encourage stable family units and community growth. Hardships and discontent. The settlers faced immense hardships: disease, food shortages, labor shortages, and supply delays. The trustees' restrictions on land ownership and the ban on slavery created economic challenges and fueled discontent among settlers, especially those who migrated from other colonies. The malcontents and the end of the trustee era. A group known as the malcontents, wealthy landowners and merchants, lobbied for the repeal of the trustees' policies, arguing they stifled economic potential. By 1752, the trustees surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony. Restrictions on land and slavery were lifted, and the colony's economy and society began to resemble those of its southern neighbors. Adaptation and transformation. Despite the challenges, the settlers adapted, building communities, establishing trade, and demanding change. The transition from trustee to royal colony marked a turning point, as Georgia shifted from a social experiment to a plantation society. Long-term consequences for Georgia's identity and the American South. The legacy of experimentation and reform. Georgia's founding as a social experiment left a lasting imprint on its identity. The early emphasis on reform, diversity, and utopian ideals contributed to a sense of exceptionalism and a tradition of questioning established norms. This legacy is reflected in Georgia's later history, including its role in the civil rights movement and ongoing debates about social justice. B. The power of myth in identity formation. The debtors' colony myth, though historically inaccurate, has become a powerful part of Georgia's collective memory. As with other foundational myths, it serves to create a narrative of redemption, opportunity, and social mobility, values that continue to shape the state's self-image. The myth's persistence highlights the importance of storytelling in the formation of regional and national identities. C. The shift to plantation society and Southern identity. The legalization of slavery and the rise of the plantation economy brought Georgia into alignment with the broader Southern identity. The colony's social structure became increasingly stratified, dominated by a planter elite and a large enslaved population. This shift had profound consequences for Georgia's role in the American South, contributing to the region's economic development, social hierarchy, and eventual conflict over slavery. D. Cultural diversity and religious pluralism. Georgia's early encouragement of diverse European immigration and religious tolerance within limits broadened the cultural base of the South. The pluralism of the early colony foreshadowed the region's later role as a crossroads of cultures, especially as new groups settled and assimilated martial tradition and frontier mentality. Georgia's role as a military buffer and its experience with frontier warfare reinforced the Southern tradition of martial valor, defense of territory, and a sense of embattled identity. These themes would echo in Southern culture through the Civil War and beyond. Comparative perspective, Georgia and other Southern colonies. Georgia's initial divergence from the plantation model and its later convergence highlight the dynamic nature of Southern identity. While Virginia and South Carolina were defined early by aristocracy and slavery, Georgia's experiment with social reform and diversity added complexity to the Southern experience. Over time, the blending of these influences helped shape the region's distinctive culture, marked by both hierarchy and populism, tradition and adaptability. For scholarly reflections and the ongoing legacy. The role of founding myths. Scholars emphasize that Georgia's founding myths, especially the debtors' colony narrative, play a central role in the state's identity. These myths, while not always historically accurate, provide a sense of purpose and continuity, linking the past to the present. The enduring influence of early ideals. The early ideals of equality, opportunity, and reform, though ultimately overtaken by economic and social realities, continue to influence Georgia's self-image and its place in the American South. The state's history of experimentation, adaptation, and resilience is a testament to the enduring power of founding visions, even when only partially realized. The importance of inclusive history. Recent scholarship and public history initiatives have sought to broaden the narrative of Georgia's founding, highlighting the experiences of Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and diverse settlers. This more inclusive approach enriches our understanding of the state's history and its ongoing evolution. Conclusion. The legacies of Georgia's founding are complex and multifaceted. The enduring myths of its origin as a debtors' colony, the profound impacts on Native Americans, enslaved Africans and settlers, and the long-term consequences for Georgia's identity and the American South all speak to the power of history, both real and imagined, in shaping who we are. Georgia's story is one of hope and hardship, idealism and adaptation, myth and reality. Its unique founding vision, the struggles and transformations of its people, and the ongoing negotiation of its identity offer a window into the broader American experience. As we continue to reflect on Georgia's past, we are reminded that history is not just a record of what was, but a living legacy that shapes our present and our future. The enduring myths of Georgia's origin as a debtors' colony. The birth of a myth. The story of Georgia as a debtors' colony is one of the most persistent and colorful in American history. It conjures images of English debtors, released from prison and shipped across the Atlantic to start anew in a land of opportunity. This narrative, repeated in textbooks, popular histories, and even tourism brochures, has become a foundational myth of Georgia's identity. But how did this myth arise, and what does the historical record actually show? Oglethorpe, the Trustees, and the real founding vision. James Oglethorpe, a British Member of Parliament and social reformer, was deeply moved by the plight of debtors languishing in English prisons. His advocacy for prison reform and his role in founding Georgia led to the widespread belief that the colony was established as a refuge for debtors. The trustees' promotional materials and early public discussions further fueled this association. However, the reality was more nuanced. The trustees' actual policy was to help the worthy poor, impoverished but skilled individuals who could contribute to the colony's success. While the idea of resettling debtors was present in early discussions, very few actual debtors were sent to Georgia. Most settlers were not released from prison, but rather selected for their industriousness and potential, the evolution and persistence of the myth. The debtors' colony narrative gained traction in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when American school textbooks and popular history simplified Georgia's founding story. The image of a penal colony, settled by men released from English prisons, became entrenched in the public imagination. Even as historians began to challenge this myth, it persisted due to its narrative appeal and symbolic resonance. The story of redemption, new beginnings, and the American dream. Modern scholarship and the real demographics. Recent scholarship has clarified that while many early Georgia settlers were poor and some were in debt, very few were actually imprisoned debtors. The trustees were careful to select useful, in-want, and well-recommended individuals, often requiring proof that applicants were not fleeing creditors or abandoning families. The majority of settlers were English, Scottish, German Protestants, notably the Salzburgers, Jews, and other Europeans seeking opportunity and religious freedom. Key takeaway: Georgia was not founded as a penal colony for debtors, but as a philanthropic experiment for the poor and unemployed. The debtors' colony myth, though persistent, is largely a product of historical misunderstanding and narrative simplification too. The impact on Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and settlers, Native Americans, dispossession and disruption, early relations and diplomacy. Before European colonization, the area now known as Georgia was home to complex indigenous societies, including the Creek, Muskogee, Cherokee, and Yamacraw. The founding of Georgia brought an influx of settlers, leading to increasing pressure on native lands. Oglethorpe initially sought peaceful relations, negotiating land cessions with the Creek and establishing a cooperative relationship with Tomochichi and the Yamacraw, which allowed the English to establish Savannah land loss and forced removal. Despite early diplomacy, the expansion of the colony led to the steady encroachment on Native American territory. The Creek and Cherokee, in particular, faced increasing land loss as settlers moved inland. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia and the growth of the plantation economy accelerated dispossession. By the 19th century, federal and state policies culminated in the forced removal of the Creek and Cherokee, most infamously through the Trail of Tears cultural disruption and legacy. The founding of Georgia disrupted indigenous societies through land loss, population displacement, and cultural change. Despite these challenges, the Creek and Cherokee have maintained cultural connections to Georgia, and their histories are increasingly recognized and preserved in the state. Enslaved Africans, from prohibition to plantation. The trustees' ban on slavery. One of the most distinctive features of Georgia's founding was the trustees' prohibition of slavery. Oglethorpe and the trustees believed that banning slavery would encourage the settlement of English and Christian people and prevent the rise of a plantation aristocracy. The goal was to create a society of smallholding farmers, free from the social and economic inequalities of the plantation South. Lessons from Georgia's complicated beginnings. Conclusion: why Georgia's founding still matters. Introduction: the enduring echoes of a grand experiment. The founding of Georgia is not merely a regional curiosity or a footnote in the annals of American history. Rather, it is a living case study in the ambitions, contradictions, and legacies that have shaped the United States from its earliest days. Conceived in 1732 as a philanthropic and strategic outpost, a buffer colony, with a utopian heart, Georgia's story is one of high ideals colliding with harsh realities. Its journey from a social experiment to a plantation society mirrors the broader American struggle to balance idealism and pragmatism, philanthropy and empire, liberty and bondage, and the ever-present threat of Spanish and Native American attack. The limitations of this utopian plan became painfully clear. Primary source excerpt from a letter by a Savannah settler, 1735. We are much afflicted with sickness, and the land is not so fruitful as was promised. Many of our number have perished, and those that remain are in want of labor and supplies. Lesson. Idealism is a powerful force, but it must be tempered by an honest reckoning with environmental, economic, and human realities. The trustees' vision, though noble, was ultimately unsustainable in the face of the New World's challenges. The power of economic imperatives. The trustees' bans on slavery and large landholdings were intended to foster an egalitarian society. However, settlers, especially those with experience in neighboring South Carolina, argued that without enslaved labor and the ability to accumulate land, Georgia could not compete economically. The eventual lifting of these bans in the 1750s marked a dramatic shift, transforming Georgia into a plantation society and aligning it with the broader Southern economy. Mini-essay, The Utopian Vision versus Colonial Realities. The trustees' Georgia experiment was a direct challenge to the plantation model. Yet, the lure of cash crops and the labor demands of rice and indigo cultivation proved irresistible. Economic necessity, more than ideology, drove the colony's transformation, a pattern seen throughout colonial America. C. The inevitability of conflict and adaptation. Georgia's location on the imperial frontier meant that conflict, both with European rivals and with Native American nations, was a constant. The colony's survival depended on diplomacy, military preparedness, and the ability to adapt to shifting alliances and threats. Biographical spotlight, Tomochichi. Tomochichi, the Miko, chief of the Yamakra, played a pivotal role in the colony's early years. His willingness to negotiate with Oglethorpe and his journey to England as an ambassador for his people exemplify the complex, often fragile nature of Anglo-Indian diplomacy. D. The enduring impact of diversity. From its inception, Georgia was a mosaic of cultures: English, Scots, Salzburgers, Jews, and others. This diversity brought both friction and resilience, as settlers drew on a wide range of skills and traditions to survive and build community. Biographical spotlight, Mary Musgrove. Mary Musgrove, born to a Creek mother and English father, was the indispensable interpreter and cultural broker between Oglethorpe and the Creek. Her story highlights the essential, if often overlooked, role of women and people of mixed heritage in colonial encounters too. The balance of idealism and pragmatism in colonial history. A. Oglethorpe, the idealist and the pragmatist. James Oglethorpe embodied the tension between high-minded reform and practical leadership. A champion of the poor and a critic of slavery, he was also a military strategist and a shrewd negotiator. His ability to adapt, whether in forging alliances with Native Americans or responding to settler grievances, was crucial to the colony's survival. Primary source excerpt from Oglethorpe's letter to the trustees, 1734. We must be ever vigilant, for the Spaniards to the south and the French to the west do not sleep. Our alliances with the Creek are our best defense, but we must also attend to the needs and complaints of our own people. B. The trustees' shifting stance. Initially steadfast in their ideals, the trustees gradually yielded to settler demands. The lifting of the slavery ban and land restrictions were not ideological conversions, but pragmatic concessions to the realities of colonial life and economic competition. C. The settlers' pragmatic demands. Settlers, too, were driven by a mix of hope and hard-nosed pragmatism. Their petitions for enslaved labor and larger landholdings were rooted in the desire to survive and prosper, not necessarily in a rejection of the trustees' ideals. Primary source excerpt from a petition by the malcontents, 1738. We, the undersigned, humbly represent that the present restrictions on Negro labor and the size of land grants do greatly hinder our progress and prosperity. Our neighbors in Carolina thrive by these means, whilst we, though industrious, struggle to cultivate our lands and compete in the markets. The third, Reflections on Philanthropy, Empire, and the Making of America. A. Philanthropy as a tool of empire. Georgia's founding was both a philanthropic project and a strategic maneuver. The colony served as a buffer against Spanish Florida and French Louisiana, protecting the wealth of South Carolina and advancing British imperial interests. The trustees' social experiment, while sincere, was inseparable from the geopolitical calculations of empire. B. The contradictions of liberty. E. Georgia's rapid transition from a slavery-free colony to a slave society underscores the contradictions at the heart of the American experiment. The ideals of liberty and equality coexisted uneasily with the realities of bondage and exploitation, a tension that would shape the South and the nation for generations. Mini-essay, The Impact on Enslaved Africans. The legalization of slavery in 1751 marked a turning point. The enslaved population grew rapidly, and the wealth of the colony became increasingly dependent on their labor. The voices and experiences of these men, women, and children, often silenced in the historical record, are essential to understanding Georgia's true legacy. C. The enduring struggle for justice. The experiences of Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and even the malcontent settlers reveal a continuous struggle for justice, recognition, and self-determination. These struggles, rooted in the colonial past, echo in contemporary movements for civil rights and social equity. D. Shaping the American South. Georgia's evolution from a unique social experiment to a quintessential Southern state profoundly influenced the identity of the American South. Its embrace of plantation agriculture, slavery, and a hierarchical social structure contributed to the region's distinctiveness and to the tensions that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. EV. Why Georgia's founding still matters. Georgia's founding is a powerful reminder that history is rarely simple or linear. It is a story of competing visions, human resilience, and the often unintended consequences of grand designs. The lessons from Georgia's beginnings, the fragility of utopian ideals, the power of economic forces, the inevitability of conflict, and the enduring impact of diversity, remain profoundly relevant. By reflecting on Georgia's unique journey, we gain a deeper understanding of the intricate balance between idealism and pragmatism that has always characterized the American experience. We are reminded that the making of America was not a monolithic process, but a dynamic interplay of philanthropy and empire, liberty and bondage, cooperation and conflict. Georgia's story is a testament to the enduring human capacity for both noble aspiration and profound contradiction. It compels us to ask, what ideals do we champion today? What pragmatic compromises are we willing to make? And what legacies will we leave for future generations? The answers to these questions, much like the history of Georgia, will continue to shape the ongoing American story. Features for reader engagement. Primary source excerpts. Throughout the narrative, direct quotes from letters, colonial charters, settlers' diaries, and treaties are woven in to provide authentic voices and first-hand perspectives. For example, the Charter of Georgia, 1732, and the correspondence between Oglethorpe and the trustees offer invaluable insights into the colony, its founding ideals and daily challenges. Biographical spotlights. Sidebars or pop-up boxes feature concise profiles of key figures such as James Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove, humanizing the story and highlighting their diverse experiences and contributions. Maps and period artwork. The text is illustrated with historical maps, such as Emmanuel Bowen's 1748 map and Peter Gordon's 1734 map of Savannah, and period engravings, visually representing the geography, settlements, and cultural encounters of colonial Georgia. Mini-essays on key debates. Short sidebars explore topics like the myth of the debtors colony, the utopian vision of the trustees, and the complexities of Anglo-Indian diplomacy, encouraging critical thinking and nuanced understanding. Discussion questions. Each major section concludes with thought-provoking questions suitable for classroom or book club discussion, such as, how did the trustees' ideals shape the early years of Georgia, and why did they ultimately fail? In what ways did economic necessity override social and moral ideals in colonial Georgia? How do the experiences of Georgia's diverse settlers inform our understanding of American identity today? Interactive elements. Where feasible, the blog includes embedded links to digital archives, such as the Georgia Archives Virtual Vault and the Digital Library of Georgia, recommended reading lists, and virtual tours of historic sites like Wormslow Historic Site and Fort Frederica, allowing readers to explore the places and documents discussed.